She stood in the opulent bridal chamber, her wedding dress still on, and silently removed each of her diamond earrings. No tears, no trembling, only the empty eyes of someone accustomed to suffering. Cassian Varelli, the man who had just given her the ring in front of hundreds of guests, stood behind her, contemplating the day he would destroy everything she had. But as Seraphine Vale's sleeve slipped down for a brief moment, and Cassian saw the deep silver scars on her shoulder, his perfect plan began to crumble. This is the story of a marriage built on ashes, a man who came to destroy, and a woman who turned him into her own weapon. Watch to the end, like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The rain came in sideways off the Hudson that night, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack. Sheets of cold water driving against glass and stone, and the black marble facade of the Varelli estate on East 64th Street, like the city itself had a score to settle. Inside, the chandeliers burned at full wattage. 300 candles had been lit by staff wearing white gloves. The flowers alone had cost $40,000, flown in from somewhere that wasn't New York and wasn't winter. A string quartet had played for 5 hours. The caterers were still clearing crystal glasses from surfaces no one had actually sat at for more than 10 minutes. The wedding of Cassian Varelli and Seraphine Vale had been called the event of the decade by 2 separate columnists who hadn't been invited but wrote about it anyway, sourcing everything from photographs taken through telephoto lenses across the street. The photograph showed a groom in a charcoal Brioni suit with a jaw cut from something harder than stone, and a bride in ivory silk so precisely fitted it looked painted on. Her dark hair swept up and back in a way that exposed her long neck and the delicate line of her collarbone. She looked, one columnist wrote, like something that belonged behind museum glass. She looked, Cassian thought now, like someone who had been told to stand a certain way for so long that her spine had simply accepted it as normal. He stood near the window on the far side of the bedroom suite, jacket off, the top button of his shirt undone, watching her at the vanity mirror. She didn't look at him in the reflection. She removed the diamond earrings, Cartier, borrowed from the Vale family vault, not actually hers in any real sense, and set them in their velvet box with the kind of careful precision that spoke of someone who knew they'd be inventoried the next morning. Then she reached for the pins in her hair, working each one loose with quiet efficiency, and the dark waves came down around her shoulders, and she still didn't look at him. 300 guests, a 10-course dinner, a ceremony witnessed by federal judges, 2 sitting senators, and a man Cassian had every intention of watching die within the next calendar year. And now this. Silence and a woman taking off borrowed jewelry. "You can drop the act," Cassian said. She didn't flinch. That was the first thing he noticed, that she absorbed the words without any visible reaction, the way you absorb the cold when you've been standing in it long enough that your nerve endings have renegotiated their relationship with sensation. She just kept removing hairpins and setting them in a small ceramic dish like he hadn't spoken at all. I said, "I heard you." Her voice was low and even, not cold exactly, more like a temperature that had already been cold for so long it had ceased to register as extreme. She met his eyes in the mirror finally, and her gaze was direct in a way he hadn't expected. Not defiant, not afraid. Just tired in a way that sat behind her eyes like water at the bottom of a very old well. "There's no act to drop. This is what I look like." Cassian crossed his arms. He was 34 years old, and he had negotiated with men who kept severed fingers in desk drawers. And this woman unsettled him in a way he didn't enjoy and had no immediate framework for. "Your father gave a toast tonight about family legacy and unity. You smiled through the whole thing." "I've been smiling through his speeches for 26 years. She reached for a silk robe hanging from the vanity chair, ivory, monogrammed with her new initials in script that someone had ordered before the wedding without asking her preference. And that was when it happened. She stood to reach for it, and the motion shifted the shoulder seam of her dress, and the long, fitted sleeve rode up just fractionally at the wrist, and the sleeve of her inner garment, a thin silk underlayer she wore beneath the gown, pulled with it, and for perhaps 2 seconds, Cassian had a clean line of sight to her forearm and the lower edge of what continued up past her elbow toward her shoulder, silver white, textured. Not 1 or 2 marks, but a topography of them, layered over years, healed into ridges that caught the light. Seraphine caught the direction of his gaze. She pulled the robe on in one smooth motion and tied it at the waist, and the expression that crossed her face was something Cassian had only ever seen once before in his life, on a dog that a neighbor's son used to kick, that had learned the precise geometry of every room in the house and moved through them all in calculated arcs that kept it out of arm's reach. Not cowering, calculating. "Don't," she said quietly. The single word hung in the air between them. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain intensified against the windows. Somewhere below them in the estate, he could hear the last of the staff finishing cleanup, the muffled clink of glass and murmur of voices. "How many people know?" he asked. Something shifted in her face, so briefly he almost missed it. A crack in a wall that had been standing for years, opening for a half second, and then sealing back over. She turned away from him and looked out the window at the rain instead. "No one who's going to say anything," she said. "So if you're thinking about leverage, you're too late. Everyone who matters already knows, and everyone who knows is already owned." He had come into this marriage with a complete file on Seraphine Vale. 47 pages assembled by the best private intelligence firm his money could buy. He knew her educational history, her travel records, her spending patterns, the names of the 3 friends she'd had in boarding school, and the circumstances under which each friendship had ended. He knew her blood type, her prescription history, her property holdings. He thought he had known everything there was to know about her. The file had said nothing about this. He went to bed that night on the opposite side of the enormous suite, and he lay in the dark listening to rain against marble, and he thought about the 47 pages and everything they hadn't told him, and he did not sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. The plan had been Cassian's for 6 years. He had constructed it slowly and with great deliberateness, the way a craftsman builds something that needs to hold weight, not fast, not flashy, but fitted at every joint. He had spent 2 years working in financial forensics before anyone knew who he was, learning the architecture of how money moved when it wanted not to be seen. He had spent another 2 cultivating the specific relationships required: federal investigators who were frustrated and underpaid, journalists who were hungry and principled, mid-level operatives inside the Vale organization who were one grievance away from defection. He had rebuilt the Varelli syndicate from the scattered remnants his father had left behind. The territory disputes, the unpaid debts, the men who had gone to other organizations when the leadership collapsed, and he had built it into something leaner and more dangerous than it had ever been. And then he had very deliberately begun to make himself visible to Lucien Vale. Lucien Vale had noticed. Lucien Vale had considered the landscape and decided that a merger was preferable to a war, and had approached Cassian through 3 separate intermediaries over the course of 8 months. And the proposal had eventually come down to what it always came down to in these arrangements: his daughter. Cassian had said yes. What Lucien Vale did not know, what no one outside of 2 men Cassian trusted with his life knew, was that the marriage was the mechanism. The plan had always been to get inside the Vale organization structurally, legally, intimately enough to dismantle it from within. Seraphine's inheritance, once legally transferred via the marriage contract into joint holdings, gave Cassian access to financial instruments that would otherwise be locked behind 7 layers of Vale family legal protection. Her name on the same documents as his name meant that when everything collapsed, and he had engineered it to collapse with the precision of a controlled demolition, the fallout would land on the Vale organization and not on him. She was a tool. That was how he had thought about it. A key in a lock. He had felt no particular discomfort about this. Lucien Vale had ordered the murder of Cassian's father at a dinner table in 2004, and the order had been carried out within 48 hours, and Cassian had been 14 years old when the call came. His brother Marco had been 16. Marco had spent the next decade trying to find evidence, building his own parallel investigation, getting too close. And then Marco had disappeared on a Tuesday in October 3 years ago, and had not been seen since, and every trail Cassian had followed in the aftermath had gone cold in ways that were too deliberate to be coincidence. Tools did not require guilt. Tools were what you used to get the job done. He repeated this to himself on the 3rd morning of the marriage while he stood at the window of his private office on the 2nd floor and watched Seraphine walk through the formal garden below, alone, her hands loose at her sides, her face turned up slightly toward the gray November sky. She walked like someone who was measuring the distance between herself and every exit simultaneously. Slowly, methodically. her breath visible in the cold. He thought about the marks on her arm and turned back to his desk. He began digging 2 weeks after the wedding, and he told himself it was strategic. He needed to understand the full extent of Lucian Vale's leverage over Seraphine in order to accurately model how she might behave under pressure. That was all. He needed the complete picture. He started with the surgeon. Cassian had a name, Dr. Emil Voss, a private practice orthopedic specialist with a clinic in the West Village and a secondary residence in Connecticut. He found the name in Seraphine's prescription records, which had taken his people 40 hours and $4,000 to access through back channels. Voss had treated Seraphine 7 times over a 14-year period, always in cash, always with no insurance filed, always for injuries categorized vaguely as domestic accident. The first treatment had been when Seraphine was 12 years old. Cassian drove to Connecticut on a gray Tuesday morning and sat in a car parked outside Voss's secondary residence for 3 hours before the man appeared. Then he got out of the car and walked to the front door and knocked. And when Voss opened the door, Cassian put his hand flat against it before it could close. Voss was 61, soft around the middle, with the eyes of a man who had been carrying something he wasn't sure he could keep carrying. He recognized Cassian's name. He stepped back from the door. The conversation lasted 90 minutes and took place in Voss's kitchen, at a table cluttered with mail and the remnants of a breakfast nobody had cleared. Voss talked with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold in the first 20 minutes. He didn't need a great deal of pressure. He had been waiting, Cassian suspected, for a very long time for someone to ask. The first injury, when Seraphine was 12, 2 broken ribs and a fractured clavicle, presented as a fall down a staircase. Voss had treated it. He told himself what doctors in those situations tell themselves. The second and third and fourth, escalating. Always the same cash arrangement, always the same story. Voss had started keeping his own records because he said this looking at the cold coffee, not at Cassian, because he thought someday it might matter. The records were in a manila envelope in a filing cabinet in the next room, which he retrieved and handed across the table without being asked. Cassian drove back to the city with the envelope on the passenger seat and his hands precise and controlled on the wheel and a kind of cold that lived somewhere behind his sternum that had nothing to do with the November temperature. He kept digging. He pulled the household staff records from the Vale estate going back 15 years. It took 6 days and 3 separate angles of approach, because Lucian Vale maintained his household staff under a labyrinthine arrangement of employment contracts through shell LLCs that made a simple records request impossible. He got there through a former housekeeper named Dolores Marsh, who had left the Vale employ in 2018 and was located, after some effort, in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Astoria with 2 cats and a deep-seated, furious willingness to talk. Cassian sat across from Dolores Marsh in her kitchen while the cats walked across surfaces they weren't supposed to be on. And Dolores talked for 2.5 hours with the kind of precision that came from having rehearsed the story in her head many times without anyone to tell it to. She had kept notes. She had dates. She had the names of other staff members who had witnessed things and been paid to forget them or simply fled without being paid at all. The picture that assembled itself from Dolores's account was of a household organized primarily around containment. Seraphine's movements tracked and reported to Lucien through a rotating series of staff members who functioned less as domestic employees and more as surveillance operatives. Her phone calls logged. Her correspondence, physical and electronic, reviewed. Her social engagements managed through a social secretary who reported directly to Lucien's chief of staff rather than to Seraphine herself. Did she know? Cassian asked. Dolores looked at him like he'd asked if rain was wet. She grew up in it. You don't know what you don't know when you don't know anything else. Was there ever a time when she... Once, Dolores said. When she was 19, she tried to leave. She made it to JFK. She had a bag packed. She had a ticket to somewhere. I don't know where. Her father had men at every terminal. They brought her back in a car. She was in her room for 3 weeks after that, and nobody was allowed in, not even the cleaning staff, food left outside the door. She paused. She never tried again. Not that I saw. Cassian asked about the mother. Dolores was quiet for a moment. One of the cats jumped into her lap, and she stroked it mechanically. I wasn't there when it happened. I came to work for the family 4 years after, but some of the older staff, the ones who'd been there longer, they talked sometimes when they'd had enough to drink and they forgot you were listening. She looked at her hands. The official story is that Helena Vale died in a car accident in 1998. That's what the obituary said. That's what Lucian told everyone. She paused again. What the old staff said was different. Cassian waited. They said Helena found something she wasn't supposed to find, about where the money came from. And they said she told someone about it, tried to go to someone official. And they said that 3 days later there was a car accident on a mountain road in upstate New York, and Helena was in the car alone and the car went off the road, and that was that. Dolores's hands stilled. They said Seraphine was in the house when the call came, 8 years old. They said her father took the call in his study and came out and poured himself a drink and didn't cry. He told himself, on the drive back to Manhattan, that none of this changed anything, that what had been done to Seraphine Vale was the instrument of another man's cruelty and was therefore separate from Cassian's calculation, that her suffering did not constitute a claim on his conscience, that the plan was the plan, and the plan was for a reason, and the reason was real, and had cost him everything that had ever mattered to him. He told himself this 3 times. He didn't quite believe it by the 3rd time. When he arrived at the estate, he found Seraphine in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, not the sitting room, but the actual kitchen. The staff one, at the long prep counter, making tea with the systematic focus of someone for whom the ritual of simple physical tasks was a necessary neurological reset. She was wearing a gray cashmere pullover with sleeves pushed to the elbow, her arms bare, visible, the marks visible, with the kind of deliberateness that struck him as either profound self-acceptance or a test of some kind. Maybe both. She looked up when he came in. There's water in the kettle if you want it. He poured himself a cup and stood on the other side of the counter, and they were quiet for a moment with steam rising between them. I need to ask you something, he said. You've been asking things for 2 weeks, she said. You think I can't tell when I'm being investigated? He was quiet. You went to Voss, she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice hadn't changed temperature. And before that, the financial records. And someone talked to Dolores. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him with those exhausted, direct eyes. So you know. Some of it. Most of it, she corrected. Whatever you found, it's most of it. There isn't much that was ever hidden very well. My father never felt the need to be particularly careful. He knew no one was going to say anything that could touch him. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want to know that you don't already know? Cassian looked at her. He thought about the envelope in his safe upstairs. He thought about a 12-year-old girl and a surgeon who kept records in a filing cabinet. He thought about a woman on a mountain road and an 8-year-old in a house waiting for news. Your mother, he said. Seraphine's hands tightened around the mug, just slightly, a single breath held and released. What about her? You were there when he got the call. She was very still for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was dark, the last of the November light gone, and the window was dark glass reflecting the lit kitchen back at them. 2 people standing at a counter with steam rising from their cups, like something out of a painting nobody would want to hang anywhere. I was in the hallway, she said finally. I was supposed to be in my room. I snuck out because I wanted to. I don't know. I wanted a glass of water. I wanted to see if my mother had come back yet. She'd been gone since the morning, and I didn't know why. She stopped. The stillness in her was the kind that came from having told this story to herself so many times that the telling of it had become its own kind of weight. He came out of the study and saw me in the hallway. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me. And then he said, Your mother won't be coming home. Go back to your room. She looked down at the mug. I asked him what happened. He said accidents happen to people who don't know how to stay in their lane. Cassian said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. I was 8, Seraphine said. I didn't understand what he meant. I learned later. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, with an openness that sat alongside the exhaustion rather than behind it. And he understood that she was showing him something she did not show people, not because she trusted him exactly, but because she was done carrying it alone in this particular room on this particular night. He kept me because I knew, not because he loved me, because I was a liability he could control more easily than he could eliminate, and because he needed someone to inherit so the money could keep moving. A pause. And because I think part of him enjoyed it. The tea had gone lukewarm. Neither of them moved to do anything about it. Cassian, she said. And the use of his name, the first time she'd said it without the formal register she usually wrapped around it, landed somewhere in his chest with a weight he wasn't prepared for. Why are you really asking? You didn't marry me to help me. I know what you married me for. I read enough of your financial strategy before the wedding to understand the basic structure. She watched him. So why are you digging? He could have lied. He had prepared long ago for every version of this conversation that ended with a lie. He had prepared the lies carefully, aged them, made sure they had the structural integrity to hold under examination. He looked at the marks on her forearms. He thought about Voss's kitchen. He thought about Dolores's hands going still. I'm not sure anymore, he said. And for the first time in 6 years, that was the truth. But he couldn't sleep again that night. He lay in the dark of the suite's second bedroom. They had arrived at a wordless arrangement in which the vast space was divided between them by nothing more than habit and mutual understanding. And he stared at the ceiling and ran the plan through his head the way he always did when he couldn't sleep, checking every joint, every load-bearing element. The plan still worked. Mechanically, structurally, it still worked. The financial documents were in motion. The federal contacts were in place. The timeline was intact. Nothing had changed. He thought about Seraphine saying, "You married me for the money." He thought about the accuracy of that and the incompleteness of it simultaneously. And he thought about the fact that she had said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse than bitterness would have. Bitterness was an emotion. What she had said it with was simple factual accounting, the tone of someone who has long since done the math on their own situation and arrived at a number they can live with. He was still thinking about this when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from a number saved only as a string of digits. No name. The message was 4 words. Package arrived. Call when ready. He stared at the ceiling for another 30 seconds. Then he got up, moved to the window, and called the number. The voice on the other end was Tomas Weil, 62, former Interpol, currently in Cassian's employ as a shadow investigator for projects that couldn't be filed. "We found something," Tomas said, without preamble. "In the Vale offshore architecture. It took us 3 weeks, and it's not everything, but it's enough to start seeing the shape of it." "Tell me." "The trafficking routes. We knew about 2. There are 7. And Cassian," a pause that Tomas, who was not given to dramatic pauses, had clearly decided was warranted. "One of them intersects with a property transaction from 2021 in the Catskills. A warehouse purchase. We ran the purchase records backward." Cassian's hand tightened around the phone. "The warehouse," Tomas said, "was used for holding, short term. We found intake records in the property management files, disguised as shipping manifests, but the dates and quantities don't match anything legitimate. And one of the names in the records..." Another pause. "I had to look at it 3 times, Cassian. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city did at 3 in the morning, glittering with indifferent energy, cabs moving in yellow streaks, a siren somewhere distant, the Hudson dark and enormous, just visible between buildings." "Just say it," Cassian said. "Marco Varelli," Tomas said. "Intake record dated October 14th, 2021, which is 4 days after he disappeared." The room went very still. Cassian stood at the window for a long time after the call ended, his phone in his hand, the city outside unchanged and indifferent, and something reorganized itself in the deep architecture of him. Not the plan, not the mechanics of what came next, but something older and less rational and considerably more dangerous. His brother was alive, or had been, 4 days after disappearing, in a warehouse owned by Lucian Vale, which meant that everything Cassian had built toward, the patience, the years, the marriage, the financial architecture, all of it, had just become something different. Not a controlled demolition anymore. Something with fire in it. He was still standing there when the door between their rooms opened, and Seraphine appeared in the doorway in the gray cashmere again, her hair loose, clearly also unable to sleep, clearly having heard the low murmur of his voice on the phone. She read his face in the dark the way someone reads weather, quickly, practically, with no illusions about what the signs meant. "What happened?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her. This woman he had married as a key in a lock. This woman with her surgeon's records and her dead mother and her 8-year-old self in a hallway learning what accidents happen meant. and he made a decision that wasn't in any version of the plan. "I need you to tell me everything you know about your father's warehouse properties," he said. "All of them. Upstate, out of state, foreign jurisdiction, everything." She was quiet for a moment, reading his face. "Why?" "Because I think my brother is still alive," he said. "And I think your father knows exactly where he is." The silence between them shifted. Something in Seraphine's face changed. Not softening exactly, more like a realignment, a compass needle finding north. She crossed her arms and the marks on her forearms caught the ambient light from the window. And she looked at him with those exhausted, direct eyes, and for the first time since the wedding night, she looked like someone who had decided something. "Sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." She made him wait while she got dressed, not because she needed to. The cashmere pullover and the loose pants she'd slept in were perfectly adequate for a conversation, but because the act of making him wait was one of the only forms of control she still possessed in her own home, and she was not yet ready to give that up. She went back through the connecting door and he heard the quiet sounds of drawers opening and closing. And then she came back in dark jeans and a black long-sleeve shirt, her hair pulled back from her face, and she had a small leather notebook in her hand that looked old and worn along the spine from years of handling. Cassian hadn't moved from the window. She sat in the chair opposite the cold fireplace and crossed one leg over the other and opened the notebook to somewhere near the middle with the ease of someone who knew exactly which page she wanted. "Before I tell you anything," she said, "I want something." "What?" "When this is over, whatever over looks like, I want documentation. Whatever you've accumulated on my father. Financial records, testimony, correspondence, all of it." She looked up from the notebook. "I want it handed to the right federal investigators, not buried as leverage, not bargained with, actually handed over in usable form with real names attached." Cassian studied her. "You've been planning this. I've been surviving this," she said. "There's a difference. Planning implies you believed you'd have an opportunity. Surviving means you kept the information anyway because it was all you had." She held up the notebook briefly. 3 years of property transactions, staff movements, and account transfers I memorized or copied by hand because everything digital in the Vale household was monitored. She set it on her knee. "I didn't know who I'd give this to eventually. I just knew I'd need it to matter to someone." He looked at the notebook, then at her. "Deal." "Don't say it like that. Say it like you mean it." "I mean it." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, checking the tension in it for something she could use as a read on his sincerity, and then she looked down at the notebook and started talking. She talked for 2 hours. The notebook was a compressed record of years of quiet, furious intelligence work conducted under constant surveillance by someone who had learned to be invisible inside her own captivity. She had memorized routing numbers from documents left briefly on her father's desk during the 2 years she had worked as his nominal executive assistant, a role that had given her proximity to information while providing Lucian with the satisfaction of keeping her useful and observable simultaneously. She had noted the names of men who came to the estate for meetings that weren't logged in any official calendar, cross-referencing them with names that appeared on Vale Foundation donation records, building a map of the organization's outer skeleton from fragments. Cassian sat across from her and listened, and did not interrupt except to ask specific questions when she mentioned a name or location he needed clarified. The city outside moved through its dark hours. At some point, one of the kitchen staff arrived and left a tray with coffee outside the suite door, and neither of them acknowledged it until Seraphine stood to retrieve it without breaking the thread of what she was saying, setting the tray on the side table and pouring both cups without asking how he took his. He noted that she'd poured his correctly, which meant she'd paid attention at some point in the preceding weeks without appearing to. He filed that away. The warehouse in the Catskills, the one Tomas had flagged, appeared in Seraphine's records under a shell company called Arrowhead Storage Solutions, which was itself nested inside a second holding company registered in Delaware and a third in the Caymans. She had the chain of ownership written out in pencil, and when Cassian photographed the page with his phone and forwarded it to Tomas at 3:45 in the morning, Tomas responded within 6 minutes. "This fills 3 gaps we couldn't close." "How did you get this?" Cassian typed back, "Later," and put the phone face down. "There's something else," Seraphine said. She'd been watching him read Thomas's message over his phone with the careful peripheral vision of someone who had spent years reading rooms without appearing to read them. She turned a few pages forward in the notebook. There are 2 warehouses in the Catskills property chain, not one. The second one is 40 minutes from the first. It's listed under a different shell entirely. Agricultural equipment storage, which is why it wouldn't appear in a standard search cross-referencing the Arrowhead chain. She turned the notebook toward him so he could see the page. I found it because I recognized the property management company's name. My father used them for 3 other properties I already knew about. Cassian looked at the address. He looked at it for a long time. When did you record this? He asked. 14 months ago. Why didn't you? He stopped himself. Do what with it? She was quiet and even. Go to the police. My father has 3 sitting judges in his pocket and 2 deputy commissioners who've been on his payroll since before I was born. Go to the press? Every journalist who came close to the Veil organization in the last decade either retracted their story or stopped being contactable. She closed the notebook. I was waiting for someone who could actually do something with the information. I was waiting for someone with more power than my father. A pause. I thought I was waiting for someone to rescue me. It took me a long time to understand I was waiting for someone I could use. The last sentence landed without apology, and Cassian appreciated that. He had married her as a tool, and she had married him as a weapon. And at least they were now in territory that was honest, even if it was cold. The second warehouse, he said. If Marco was held at the first one 4 days after he disappeared, then they moved him, she said. That's standard practice in my father's operations. Nothing stays in one place long enough to become a traceable pattern. She looked at him steadily. But the second property has been in the chain for 8 years and has never been sold or transferred or cleaned out of the holding structure, which means it's been in active use continuously. Whatever they use it for, they're still using it. His jaw was tight. She could see it, the muscle working just below his cheekbone, the specific physical tell of someone holding themselves very controlled over something very not controlled underneath. I need Tomas on the second property tonight, he said, more to himself than to her. I know. She stood and picked up her coffee. I already assumed you'd need people on the ground by morning, so I'm telling you now instead of waiting. He looked up at her. How long have you known about Marco? She met his eyes. I knew your brother disappeared. I didn't know about the intake record, but I suspected my father had something to do with it. The timing of your courtship approach, the unusual speed with which my father agreed to the marriage proposal. She held the coffee with both hands. He doesn't agree to things quickly unless he has a specific advantage he wants to lock in place. He agreed to you in 3 weeks. That was either because you had something he wanted very badly or because he had something over you that he thought would keep you manageable. A beat. I assumed the latter. At 5 in the morning, Cassian went to his office and made 4 phone calls. The first was to Tomas, who was already moving toward the Catskills with 2 men Cassian trusted to be quiet and thorough. The second was to a federal investigator named Shara Okafor, who had been building a parallel RICO case against the Veil organization for 3 years on inadequate evidence, and who answered on the second ring despite the hour, because people building RICO cases with inadequate evidence did not sleep soundly. The third was to a man named Brandt, who ran Cassian's ground operations, and who needed to be put on standby without being told specifically why yet. The fourth call he didn't make until he was standing with his forehead briefly against the cold window glass, watching the first gray suggestions of dawn beginning to separate the skyline from the sky. He called his mother. Elena Varelli was 61 years old and lived in a well-secured house in Queens, and had not been told everything about Cassian's plan, because telling her everything would have required telling her the part where Marco's disappearance was still unresolved, and he had protected her from that specific piece of ongoing hope and terror for 3 years. She answered on the third ring, her voice immediately alert. A mother's instinct for calls at unusual hours, an instinct that had apparently survived everything. Cassian, I need you to go to Aunt Vera's this morning, he said. Pack for a week. Don't call anyone first. Just go. A pause. What's happened? Nothing yet. I'm being careful. Another pause. He could hear her breathing, the specific rhythm of someone who has received this kind of call before, and knows that nothing yet means something has happened or is about to, and that the correct response is not to argue. "Is it about your brother?" she said. He closed his eyes. "Go to Vera's, Mom." Cassian: "I'll call you when I can. Go." He hung up and stood with the phone at his side, and the gray dawn continuing its slow technical work on the skyline, and he breathed carefully through his nose, and he thought about what he had told Seraphine 2 hours ago. "I think my brother is still alive." He thought about how the sentence had sounded. Provisional, careful, the syntax of someone trying not to want something too badly in case the wanting made the wanting wrong. Marco was 3 years older than him. Marco had taught him to drive in an empty parking lot in Flushing when Cassian was 15. Marco had cried at their father's funeral and not been ashamed of it, which was the thing Cassian had never been able to do and had spent years quietly respecting in retrospect. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum once, hard, a gesture so private he would have denied making it to anyone who saw it, and then he went to shower and put on clean clothes and go back to work. By 9 in the morning, the estate had taken on a different quality, still and watchful, the way air feels before weather arrives. Cassian had 3 of his own men positioned on the grounds that morning, moved in under the cover of a security upgrade story that would hold for 24 hours before anyone in the Vale network noticed the personnel change and started asking questions. Seraphine was in the breakfast room when he came down, sitting at the small table near the east window with coffee and nothing else, reading something on her phone with the practiced blankness of someone who had learned to look occupied and ordinary as a survival mechanism. She put the phone down when he sat across from her. "My father called this morning," she said. Cassian poured coffee. "What time?" 7:40. "He does it every 3 days, exactly every 3 days, always between 7:30 and 8. I don't think he's aware he's that predictable." She picked up her own cup. "He asked how the marriage was settling. He asked if I'd had an opportunity to review the Vale Foundation board documents he'd sent over. I'm supposed to take a nominal seat for optics. He asked if we were thinking about travel." "What did you tell him?" "I told him everything was fine, and the documents were under review, and we hadn't discussed travel yet." She looked at the window. "The same things I always tell him. The vocabulary of managed captivity. Sound cooperative, give nothing, change nothing enough to trigger alarm." A beat. "He mentioned he'd be hosting a dinner at the Vale Foundation in 3 weeks, the annual charity gala. He'd like us both present." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "Did he say anything specific about the gala? Guest list? Arrangements?" "Only that it was important this year." His exact word. Important. She looked back at Cassian. "My father uses that word about 2 things, money and threats, sometimes simultaneously." Her eyes moved over his face. "You already know something about the gala." "Not yet." "But you suspect something." "I suspect your father doesn't do anything without 3 purposes running simultaneously, and that an event with a guest list of politicians and crime figures and federal officials at the same time he's under increasing investigative pressure is not a coincidence of calendar." Seraphine set down her coffee very carefully. "He's making a move. I think he's been making it for longer than we realized." She was quiet, and the specific quality of her quiet shifted. The same realignment he'd seen the night before, the compass needle, but sharper now, more urgent. "Then we don't have 3 weeks," she said. "No," he agreed. "We don't." Thomas called at 11:47. Cassian took the call standing in the center of his office, which was the position he adopted for calls that required him to be ready to move. Seraphine had come in without being asked and sat in the chair in the corner, which he registered and didn't challenge. "Second warehouse is active," Tomas said. His voice had the compressed quality of someone managing their delivery carefully. "We got eyes on it at 7 this morning, 12-hour watch, then called you. There's a rotation, 2 men outside, 4-hour shifts. Supply vehicles twice daily. That's not a storage facility for equipment." "What else?" "Heat signature from the north-facing structure, consistent with habitation. At least 3 bodies, possibly more." A pause. "Cassian, there were fresh tire tracks and a food delivery log in the maintenance shed. I'm looking at photographs my man pulled off the shed wall. The log has dates. The oldest entry is from 3 years ago, October. The breath Cassian took was controlled and even, and didn't give anything away to Tomas, which was the only reason he took it slowly. "October what?" he said. October 17th. 3 days after the intake record. 3 days after his brother's name had appeared in a shipping manifest in a warehouse 40 minutes north. How many people on the inside? Cassian said. We counted a minimum of 4 guards on rotation, possibly 6. The shift pattern suggests 3 on at any given time. Can you get someone in? Not without triggering the rotation alarm. They've got a check-in system every 2 hours, phone-based, specific code. If someone misses a check-in, the protocol is immediate lockdown and relocation. A pause. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. Cassian looked at the far wall of his office where a city map hung, marked with nothing that would be self-explanatory to anyone who walked in. He found the rough area of the Catskills in his mind, and he found the estate on East 64th Street, and he thought about 3 years and a Tuesday in October and a food delivery log with a date. Keep the watch on, he said. Don't move on it yet. Nothing changes until I give the word. He ended the call. Seraphine was looking at him from the corner chair. She hadn't moved. She had her arms resting on the chair arms and her hands loose, and her face was doing the careful reading the room thing that had become, over the preceding weeks, something he recognized and had stopped finding unsettling. He's there, she said. It wasn't a question. Maybe. Don't. Her voice was sharper than usual, the first time he'd heard genuine urgency crack through the surface register. Don't equivocate. You don't equivocate about anything else. Don't do it now because it's something that matters. He looked at her for a long moment. The record suggests someone has been held at that location continuously for 3 years. The timeline matches. She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened once and released. Then we go get him. It's not that simple. I know it's not that simple, she said, controlled again, the urgency tucked back under the surface. I'm not an idiot. I'm saying that's the direction, whatever path gets us there. If we move on that warehouse without the full legal scaffolding in place, your father's lawyers kill the chain of evidence. Marco's testimony, if he can testify, gets challenged on procedural grounds, and Lucien walks. He held her gaze. I've been building this for 6 years. 3 more weeks might be what the difference is between a conviction and a mistrial. And if my father is planning something at the gala that we don't fully understand yet, 3 weeks might be 3 weeks too long. They looked at each other across the office. The city was doing its late morning noise outside, distant traffic, the mechanical respiration of 10 million people going about their Tuesday. And here, it was very quiet. Then we move faster, Cassian said, on both tracks simultaneously. Tick. The next 10 days had the quality of a controlled burn. Everything moving deliberately, every action calculated, but with the underlying awareness that fire does not stay controlled forever. Cassian fed documents to Shara Okafor in carefully sequenced packages designed to build the federal case in a specific order. The financial structures first, establishing the architecture, then the property chain, then the human element. Okafor was good. She asked the right questions and didn't ask the wrong ones, and she understood without being told explicitly that the information source needed to remain undisclosed until specific protective arrangements were in place. Seraphine spent 3 of those 10 days doing something that Cassian only fully understood when he saw the results. She was mapping her father's network from the inside, using a combination of her own records and access she still nominally held as a Vale family member to trace the current operational structure of the organization. She did it in pieces, through channels that couldn't be traced back to a coordinated inquiry. And at the end of the 3 days, she spread what she had across the dining room table and walked Cassian through it with the systematic efficiency of a military briefing. He watched her do it and thought about the 47 pages his intelligence firm had given him and how inadequate they now seemed. And he thought about the surgeon's manila envelope. And he thought about Dolores Marsh's cats walking across countertops. And he thought, not for the first time and with increasing frequency, about how differently this had been supposed to go. You've done this before, he said. She looked up from the table. Done what? Briefed people. Laid out information this way. A brief hesitation. I used to rehearse it, in my head when I couldn't sleep, which was most nights. I had nobody to actually tell it to, so I told it to myself. What I'd say if someone ever appeared who could use it. She looked back down at the table. I rehearsed it so many times I could do it in my sleep. He watched her hands moving over the papers, organizing, connecting, pointing. Steady hands. He thought about all the years that steadiness had cost her. Seraphine. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said, for how I came into this. She was very still for a moment, and then she did something unexpected. She almost smiled. Not warmly exactly, more like the specific expression of someone who has survived something long enough to find the shape of it almost ironic. You married me to take me apart, she said. My father raised me to keep me imprisoned. In comparison, your intentions were practically benign. She picked up a paper and turned back to the table. Save the apology for when this is over. Right now, I need you focused. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay. On the 11th day, something went wrong. Cassian was in a meeting with Brandt and two of his senior operatives when his phone lit up with a message from Tomas that said only, call immediately. He excused himself from the meeting and stepped into the corridor and called. We have a problem at the warehouse, Tomas said. He sounded like he hadn't slept, which for Tomas meant something had gone genuinely sideways. A vehicle left the north structure at 3 this morning. We followed it. My man kept distance, clean tail. It went to a transfer point in Sullivan County and met 2 other vehicles. And one of the other vehicles was Vale's. A vehicle registered to a Vale shell company that we've flagged. A pause. The transfer point was a Vale logistics hub, which means someone at the warehouse is coordinating with Vale directly. That's expected. Let me finish. Tomas's voice was tight. My man took photographs at the transfer point. When he went to pull out, he was made. Cassian, whoever flagged him, was good. Professional-grade counter-surveillance. He managed to break contact and he's clean, but they made his vehicle. Cassian stood in the corridor very still. Are they connected to us? The vehicle registration is clean. Nothing ties it to Varelli operations directly, but they're going to run the plates and they're going to run them through every channel they have, and if there's anything in the county records that pings against any name in our network, how long do we have? 24 hours before they've exhausted the obvious checks. 48 before they start looking at adjacent connections, which meant the entire timeline had just compressed by 3 weeks into 2 days. Cassian went back into the meeting room and looked at Brandt and the 2 operatives. Brandt, who had been in this business longer than Cassian had been alive and could read the specific quality of Cassian's face the way a sailor reads weather, straightened in his chair. Everything changes tonight, Cassian said. Get everyone in, Aunt. He found Seraphine in the garden at 4 in the afternoon, which was where she went when she needed to think. She was sitting on the stone bench near the iron gate at the property's east edge, not looking at anything in particular, her coat pulled close, her breath visible in the cold. He sat beside her without preamble and told her everything. The warehouse, the counter-surveillance, the compression of the timeline. She listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds, which he had learned was her processing interval. Not hesitation, not alarm, just the 30 seconds she needed to rebuild her map of the situation and start finding the exits. My father is going to know someone is watching the warehouse within 48 hours, she said. Yes. And when he knows, he'll move whatever's inside. Yes. Which means Marco, if he's there, gets relocated, or worse. He said nothing. She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was something he hadn't seen before, not the exhaustion, not the careful steadiness, not the controlled burn intelligence. Something older and harder and more cornered. So we're not waiting for the gala, she said. No. And we're not waiting for the federal case to fully build. We can't. We move now with what we have, and we hope it's enough. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold November air. Then she looked back at the garden, at the bare-limbed trees and the dead grass and the iron gate at the property's edge. The gate that she moved within and around and had always been inside of, in some form or another. There's something I haven't told you, she said. His focus sharpened. What? The gala. She paused, and the pause had weight in it. My father called again this morning. He doesn't call off schedule unless something's changed in his plans. He said the gala had been moved up. It's in 9 days, not 3 weeks. And he said... She stopped. Her jaw worked once. He said he wanted to make sure I was there, that he'd arranged for me to give a speech, welcoming remarks, family legacy, the standard performance. She turned back to look at Cassian. He's never asked me to speak at anything in my life. I'm kept off podiums, off stages, out of photographs unless they're controlled. He doesn't like me visible. Her eyes were steady and very dark, which means he needs me there for something specific, something that isn't about welcoming remarks. The cold settled between them. He's using you as the frame, Cassian said slowly. If something happens at the gala, something violent, something catastrophic, and I'm standing on a stage representing the Veil Foundation, and you're in the room as my husband. She let the sentence sit unfinished. Cassian finished it. Then we're both in the blast radius when the frame comes down. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the November garden was very still around them, bare and cold and entirely real. He's not trying to save the organization, Seraphine said, and her voice was flat with the weight of it. He's burning it, controlled demolition. He takes the insurance, he frames the Virelli name, and he disappears with enough offshore capital to, and I'm the evidence that makes it clean. Something moved across her face, not quite grief, more like the final closing of a door she'd been keeping barely open for 26 years. He never kept me because I was useful. He kept me because I was the cleanest evidence he'd ever have. The gate at the property's edge was made of iron, black and old, and beyond it the street was visible. And beyond the street the city continued its indifferent, enormous life. Cassian reached out and took her hand, not gently, not romantically, but with the grip of someone who has just calculated the exact weight of what comes next and decided to carry it anyway. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. We go now, he said. Tonight. We pull Marco out, we hand everything to Okafor in one package, and we go to the gala ready to end this on our terms, not his. Her hand tightened around his once. Then she stood. Then we have a lot of work to do before dark, she said, and walked back toward the house. And Cassian sat for one more moment in the cold with the iron gate in front of him and the dead garden around him, and his heart doing something loud and insistent behind his ribs that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that the plan he had built for 6 years had just become something The plan had a lot of work to do before dark, and so did they. Cassian came inside 3 minutes after Seraphine and found her already at the dining room table where the network map was still spread, her coat still on, her phone in her hand scrolling through something with the compressed focus of someone who had moved past the emotional register of the last hour and was already operating in pure functional mode. He recognized the transition because he used it himself. The way you close a door on the part of you that feels things so the part of you that acts can have the room. He called Brandt first. 12 men on standby, ready to move in 4 hours. Vehicles staged in 3 separate locations outside Manhattan. The operational order was simple in structure and complicated in execution. Extract whoever was being held in the North Structure warehouse in Sullivan County, secure them, move them to a location Lucian Vale's network didn't know existed, and do all of it without triggering the 2-hour check-in protocol that would lock the facility down. Thomas had spent 11 days watching the warehouse. He knew the check-in windows. He knew the rotation pattern. He had the guard count, the vehicle positions, the single camera mounted above the north door that covered a 60-degree arc and left a blind approach from the eastern tree line. It could be done. It had to be done cleanly enough that whatever they found inside could be used, testified to, presented to Shara Okafor as something a federal court would hold. The check-in is at 8, Tomas said when Cassian called, and then at 10. If we move at 9:15, we have 45 minutes inside before the next window. Can your people manage the guards without non-lethal, Tomas said. I know, yes. Cassian looked across the room at Seraphine, who had stopped scrolling and was watching him with the map still spread under her hands. I'm coming up, he said. A pause from Tomas. Cassian, don't. You're too close to this. I know. He held Seraphine's eyes across the room. I'm still coming. Dintek. They left the estate at 6:45 in 2 vehicles. Cassian and Tomas in the lead car, Brandt and 4 men in the second, 3 more men already positioned near the warehouse since morning. Seraphine had argued to come for 4 minutes in the kitchen while Cassian was putting on his coat, and the argument had the particular texture of someone who knew they were going to lose it, but needed to make it anyway. You know the property structure better than anyone, she'd said. You've already written it down. I have it. And if something goes wrong inside and you need someone who can navigate the shell company documentation in real time, Seraphine. He'd looked at her directly, his coat half on. If your father gets word that you've left this estate tonight and driven toward one of his operational properties, it collapses everything before we're inside the building. You're the one variable he's watching. She'd gone quiet. Her jaw had set in the way he'd come to recognize as the physical expression of reasoning she disagreed with but couldn't refute. I'll be back by 2, he said. Don't make promises about timelines. Then I'll be back. She'd handed him a folded paper from the notebook, the property chain written out in her precise penciled hand, the shell company names cross-referenced in the margin. He'd put it in his inside jacket pocket without looking at it again, because he'd already memorized it from her briefing, and the act of taking it was for her more than for him. The drive north took 90 minutes, and Cassian spent most of it looking out the window at the dark highway and the dark trees and the dark sky pressing down over everything. And he did not think about what he might find in the warehouse, because thinking about it would make him imprecise, and he needed to be precise. Tomas, who had known Cassian for 11 years and understood the specific landscape of his silences, drove without speaking. They staged in the tree line at 8:57, 12 degrees and dropping. The ground was frozen solid, which was useful, no sound from footfall, and the tree line gave full concealment to within 30 meters of the building's east face. The warehouse was a converted agricultural structure, longer than wide, with a metal roof and cinder block walls that had been reinforced at some point in the last decade with secondary sheeting that had no agricultural purpose whatsoever. 2 lights on the exterior, sodium yellow, covering the south face and the main access road. The north face, the face Tomas's camera work had mapped, was dark except for the single mounted unit above the door. 3 guards visible. 2 outside on rotation, 1 positioned at the door, all armed. Cassian crouched in the tree line with Tomas on his left and Brandt on his right and watched the rotation pattern confirm itself. The 2 outside men moving in a circuit that took 11 minutes per loop, which Tomas had told him would be 11 minutes and was exactly that. And he breathed the cold air slowly and kept his hands loose. At 9:14, the extraction team moved. It was fast and quiet and professional in the way that things which have been planned in granular detail and executed by people who do this work can be fast and quiet and professional. The 2 exterior guards were taken between rotation points. The door guard went last, and the whole sequence from first contact to the north door standing open took 6 minutes and 40 seconds, which was within the operational window. Cassian went through the door second, behind Tomas. The interior of the warehouse was divided by a secondary wall of cinder block and corrugated sheeting. The outer section arranged with the plausible agricultural equipment that would satisfy a cursory physical inspection. The inner section accessed through a steel door that was keypad locked and took Tomas's man 2 minutes to defeat electronically. The inner section smelled of chemical disinfectant and stale air, and something underneath both of those that Cassian's body identified before his mind did and caused his shoulders to pull tight against a reaction he refused to have in front of his men. 3 rooms. 1 storage, 1 operational, a monitoring station with screens and communications equipment, currently unmanned, and 1 at the end of a short corridor with another steel door, this one locked with a physical deadbolt and a keypad simultaneously. Tomas defeated the keypad. 1 of Brandt's men handled the deadbolt. Cassian pushed the door open. Well, there was a man in this room. He was seated on a metal-framed cot against the far wall, and the first thing Cassian registered was that the posture was upright. Not the collapsed posture of someone broken, but the careful, deliberate uprightness of someone who had decided a long time ago that sitting upright was a thing they could control when other things could not be controlled, and had held on to it accordingly. The second thing he registered was the face, older, thinner. A beard he hadn't had before. The left eye held a scar through the brow above it that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But the face was Marco's face, the same jaw their father had given both of them, the same deep-set dark eyes, the same specific way the expression arranged itself when receiving information of extreme significance, which was very still and very inward, like someone turning down the external volume so the internal processing could run. Marco looked at him for 3 seconds. Then, "You're late." Cassian's throat closed completely. He stood in the doorway of the room, and his throat closed, and his eyes did something he did not permit them to do in operational contexts. And he stood there for what was probably 4 seconds but felt structural, like something load-bearing shifting. And then he crossed the room in 5 steps and put both arms around his brother, who was thinner than he'd ever been, and whose ribs Cassian could feel through the jacket they'd dressed him in. And Marco's arms came up and gripped him back with a force that communicated 3 years of everything that couldn't be said in the first 30 seconds. "I know," Cassian said into his brother's shoulder. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know you know," Marco said. His voice wasn't either. They stayed like that for a moment that Tomas and Brandt and the other men in the corridor gave them by finding things to look at that weren't the doorway. Then Marco pulled back and looked at his brother's face with the specific evaluative expression of someone taking inventory after a long absence, checking for damage, for change, for the accumulated evidence of years. "You got thinner," Marco said. "You got a beard. 3 years with no razor. You adapt." He looked past Cassian at the doorway, at the shapes of Tomas and Brandt in the corridor. "How many people?" "Enough." "Lucien's check-in protocol. We're inside the window. We need to move in the next 30 minutes. Marco nodded once, the nod of someone receiving operational information and integrating it cleanly, no argument, no lag, and stood from the cot. His legs held. He'd been keeping himself in whatever physical condition the space allowed. Cassian could see that from the way he moved. He reached under the cot mattress and produced a small object, a thumb drive, black, standard issue, and held it up between 2 fingers. Cassian stared at it. 3 years, Marco said. I had time. It. They were back in the vehicles and moving south by 10:03, inside the check-in window by 4 minutes, and Tomas received the automated all-clear signal from the warehouse's security system at 10:11, which meant the guards they'd sedated had been found and replaced. No, that meant the guards hadn't been found yet. The check-in had been triggered by the monitoring station's automated system, which ran on a separate circuit. They had bought themselves perhaps 6 hours before anyone at the warehouse realized the situation, and Cassian fully intended to have Marco in a secure location and the thumb drive in Shara Okafor's hands before those 6 hours elapsed. Marco sat in the back seat between Cassian and Brandt and said very little on the drive south, which was what Marco always did when he was processing. Went quiet and inward while his face did the slow work of reorienting to a changed world. Cassian sat beside him and didn't push, and at some point around the 40-minute mark, Marco reached over and put his hand briefly on the back of Cassian's neck, the way their father used to do when they were children, a gesture of uncomplicated love that had no modern adult vocabulary, and then removed it and looked back out the window. "Tell me about the woman you married," Marco said. Cassian was quiet for a moment. "Seraphine. Lucien's daughter." Not a question. "Yes." "How much does she know?" "More than I did." Marco was quiet, processing. "Is she, she's with us." Another processing beat. "You're sure?" Cassian thought about the notebook, the 2 hours in the dark, the hand she'd taken on the garden bench. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure." Marco didn't respond to this, but the quality of his silence shifted in a way that indicated he'd filed and accepted the information. He looked out at the dark highway and the dark trees, and Cassian watched his brother's profile. Gaunt and scarred, and older than it should be, and entirely intact in the ways that mattered, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked there for 3 years. Then Marco said, "There's something I need to tell you before we get to wherever we're going, before you talk to the federal contact." The quality in his voice made Cassian go still. Not the words, the pressure underneath them. The tone of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is now deciding the moment to set it down has come and is not entirely certain of the landing. "Tell me," Cassian said. Marco looked at his hands in his lap, then up at the back of Tomas's headrest in the front seat, then at Cassian. "The reason I got close enough to Lucien's operation that he had me taken," he said. "The reason I was able to get this close," he touched his jacket pocket where the thumb drive was. "It wasn't just investigative work. It wasn't just surveillance and document collection." He paused. "I had someone inside the Veil organization giving me access." Cassian waited. Someone who had been inside it for a long time. Someone Lucien trusted. Marco's voice was very even and very controlled in the way of something held under significant pressure. Someone who came to me 18 months before I disappeared and said they wanted out, and said they'd been watching the Virelli family from inside the Veil network and had decided we were the right people to give the information to. The highway moved under them. Cassian's pulse was steady, and his face was neutral, and everything else in him was beginning to calculate. "Who?" he said. Marco looked at him. "This is the part you're not going to like." "Who, Marco?" Her name was Renata Solis. She was Lucian Vale's chief financial architect, the person who actually built the offshore structure, the shell company chains, the trafficking route's financial backbone. She built all of it. She was inside it for 11 years. Cassian turned this name over in his mind. He didn't recognize it from any of his files. "And she came to you. She came to me with financial documents, routing maps, the full offshore architecture, everything I needed to build an airtight federal case." Marco paused. "And I trusted her, because the information was real. I verified everything she gave me independently, every single piece, and it all checked out. The documents were genuine. The routes were accurate. She gave me access to the second level of the shell company structure that nobody had ever been able to crack from the outside. And I used it, and it was real." "Zur Zeit was..." "But," Cassian said, "but the access she gave me, the way she gave me inside reach into the Veil organization's operational structure, it required me to appear, to anyone watching, as though I had been turned, as though I had become a Virelli operative who had been bought by the Veil network." He looked at Cassian steadily. "Which means that, for the 18 months I worked with Renata Solis, there is a documented record inside the Veil organization's files, surveillance logs, communications intercepts, transaction records, that shows Marco Virelli apparently cooperating with Lucian Vale." The car was very quiet except for the highway sound. "She set you up," Cassian said. "I don't know." And the weight of those 3 words, the genuine, unresolved uncertainty in them, coming from a man who had spent 3 years in a room with nothing to do but think about this, was considerable. "The information she gave me was real, every piece. I've had 3 years to go over it in my head, and I cannot find a single document she provided that wasn't genuine. Which means, if she was setting me up, she burned real operational intelligence to do it. She compromised actual Veil network assets to maintain the deception." Or, Cassian said slowly, or she was exactly what she said she was, someone who wanted out. And something else happened. Something that made Lucian realize she'd turned, and he used the existing record of my access to frame me before taking me off the board. Marco's hands were very still in his lap. "I've gone back and forth between those 2 possibilities for 3 years. I don't have an answer." Cassian sat with this. The highway signs went past in the dark. His mind was moving through the implications with the speed and coldness of something that had been trained for exactly this kind of structural reassessment, finding the load-bearing elements, checking the joints, identifying where the weight fell. "The thumb drive," he said, "everything I collected from Renata's access, everything I was able to document independently. And..." Marco reached into his jacket and produced the drive again, looking at it. "And my complete record of my contact with Renata Solis, every meeting, every document transfer, every communication, everything that could be used to either prove I was working against Lucien or to make it look like I was working for him, depending on how it's framed. Where is Renata Solis now?" Marco looked at him. "That's the other thing I need to tell you." They arrived at the Safe House, a property in the outer edges of Westchester that Cassian had held in a clean alias for 2 years and never used, at 12:40 in the morning. It was a converted carriage house at the end of a long private drive, nothing visible from the road, heated and stocked and equipped with the kind of basic communications setup that allowed work without exposure. Cassian got Marco inside and got food into him and then excused himself and went to the far end of the main room and called Seraphine. She answered on the first ring. "He's safe," Cassian said. A silence on the other end that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and contained a great deal. Then, "Okay." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "Are you coming back tonight?" "Not yet. We have a complication." "Tell me." He told her about Renata Solis in compressed factual terms, without editorializing, presenting the architecture of the problem, the documented record inside the Veil files that could be used to frame Marco, the ambiguity of Renata's actual allegiance, the question of where she was now. When he finished, Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "Renata Solis," she said. "You know the name." Not a question, because something in her silence had changed character, had gone from the processing quiet to something with more texture in it, something that was choosing its next words. "She left my father's organization 14 months ago," Seraphine said. "I recorded it in the notebook. She was listed as the financial architecture director for the Vail Foundation, which was her legitimate cover. She resigned in..." A pause, and he could hear pages turning. "She resigned in August of last year, officially for personal reasons. Did your father tell you anything about it?" "No. He never told me anything about operational personnel, but I noticed because she was the only person in his senior structure who had ever left voluntarily. Everyone else was transferred, disappeared, or stayed until they were no longer useful." A beat. "And I noticed because in the 3 months before she left, my father's behavior changed. He became more controlled than usual, which is how he behaves when something is making him angry that he can't visibly react to." Cassian thought about this. "She burned him on the way out." "That would be my read." Another pause. "Or he found out she'd been working against him and let her leave because killing her would draw attention he didn't want at the time." The pages stopped turning. "Cassian, if Renata Solis left 14 months ago with documentation that could damage my father's operation, and she was the source for everything your brother collected, then Lucien knows the documentation exists," Cassian said. "He knows Marco had access to it, and he's known for at least 14 months. The silence between them was thick. "He didn't detonate the bomb early," Seraphine said slowly. "He didn't move on Marco's information when he found out about it. He kept Marco alive, kept him held, kept the situation contained." Her voice had gone very quiet. "Why would he do that for 14 months when he could have..." And Cassian understood it at the same moment she did, could hear it in the half-second of silence before she continued, could feel the structure of it assembling in his mind with the cold clarity of something that had always been there and had only now been seen from the right angle. "Because he was waiting," Cassian said. "Because he needed the information to reappear in a controlled context," Seraphine said at the same moment. They were both quiet. "The gala," Cassian said. "He needed the documentation to surface at the gala," she said. "In the right hands, attributed to the right people. He's been holding Marco not to silence him, but to use him as the source," Cassian said. "If the documentation surfaces connected to Marco, connected to Virelli, and Lucien's already established the record showing Marco as a cooperative operative, then the federal case gets inverted," Seraphine said, and her voice had gone cold and flat and entirely clear. "Every document Marco collected, everything Renata provided, it reads as fabricated intelligence planted by the Virelli syndicate to frame the Vail organization. And you're the architect of it, because you married the Vail heir, and you had access to the organization from the inside, and you had the motive." The carriage house was very quiet around Cassian. Marco was eating at the kitchen table 20 feet away, unaware of this conversation, the thumb drive sitting on the table next to his plate. "He built the frame over 3 years, Cassian said. "He built it over longer than that," Seraphine said. "He started building it when he took Marco. He just needed the Virelli name in the right position to complete it." A pause that had the weight of something enormous. "He needed you to marry me. He proposed the marriage. He agreed to it in 3 weeks." Her voice was almost toneless now, stripped down to the bare factual architecture. "Cassian, he came to you." The single most important structural element of Cassian's plan, the thing he had believed to be his own initiative, his own strategic positioning, the move he had calculated and executed over months, had not been his. Lucien Vail had needed Cassian inside the family structure. Lucien Vail had manufactured the approach. Everything Cassian had believed he was doing to Lucien, the infiltration, the slow dismantling, the 6 years of patience, had been happening inside a container that Lucien had built and maintained and was about to close. Cassian stood in the carriage house at 12:53 in the morning and felt the full structural weight of this land on him, and he did not speak for a moment. And in that moment, every version of the plan he had ever held in his mind, every careful joint, every load-bearing element, every sequence he had checked and rechecked, dissolved with the specific finality of something that had been load-bearing and suddenly wasn't. Are you still there? Seraphine said. Yes. Cassian. Her voice had changed. It had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not the exhaustion, not the controlled clarity, but something more urgent than either. Are you listening to me? I'm listening. He doesn't know we know this yet. We have that. We have the gap between what he thinks we've figured out and what we've actually figured out. And that gap is... She stopped. He heard her moving, the sound of her crossing a room, a door closing, the specific quiet of someone who has put themselves in a contained space to think. That gap is the only weapon we have left. He moved the gala up, Cassian said, 9 days. Because Tomas's man was made at the transfer point. He knows something is in motion. He's accelerating the timeline. A breath, the first one that had sounded less than fully controlled. Cassian. He's already moving. And then Cassian heard something on her end of the line that stopped him completely. A sound beneath the room quiet she'd created, low and brief and quickly suppressed, like a door that shouldn't have been open being carefully closed. Seraphine, he said. Is there someone in the house? A half-second of silence. The specific half-second of someone who has just heard something they were hoping they'd misheard, and in the hearing of it has made an instantaneous calculation about whether to answer honestly. There's someone at the gate, she said quietly, and her voice had changed completely. Not to fear, but to something harder and colder than fear. The voice of someone who has been cornered before and knows precisely what the muscles of a cornered person are supposed to do. Cassian, there are 3 vehicles at the gate. They're Veil vehicles. I can see the plates from the upstairs window. He was already moving toward the kitchen, already meeting Marco's eyes across the room, already reading in Marco's face that his brother had heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand the shape of it. Listen to me, Cassian said into the phone. Don't open anything. Don't go to the door. The panic room off the master. I know where it is, she said, crisp. Already moving, he could hear it. I've known where it was since the 2nd day. Go there now. And then what? He thought about the gap. The gap between what Lucian thought they knew and what they actually knew. The only weapon left. And then stay there, he said, until I tell you the next move, because there is a next move. I need you to believe that. A pause. The sound of her moving. I believe it, she said, and the steadiness in her voice, unchanged, unbroken, that long-trained, impossible steadiness, did something to him that was not strategic and not useful and was entirely real. But Cassian, if he has people at the gate, he's not sending them to talk. He's sending them to finalize the call dropped. Cassian stood with the dead phone against his ear for exactly 1 second. 1 second of the specific stillness that precedes total system override, when the mind finishes its last rational calculation and hands the controls to something older and less negotiable. And then he was moving. We have to go back, he said to Marco. Marco was already standing. He'd heard enough. He had the thumb drive in his jacket pocket and his shoes on, and his eyes were doing the dark inward thing they did when he was running scenarios. And he looked at Cassian with the face of someone who understood the exact weight of what was happening and was not going to waste time on anything except what came next. How many at the gate? 3 vehicles. Veil muscle. Yes. Marco looked at Brandt, who was already on his phone in the corner of the room, and then at Tomas, who had come in from the outer room and was standing in the doorway with his coat on and his expression set in the particular configuration of a man who has done this work for 30 years and recognizes the specific shape of a situation that has no clean options. Tomas, Marco said. I heard, Tomas said. Can we get there before 90 minutes if we push it? They're already at the gate, which means they've been moving for at least 40 minutes, which means... Tomas did the math with his eyes. We're behind them. Cassian was already at the door. Then we move now. Brandt, I need 2 men staying with the house. Nobody comes in, nobody goes out until I say. Keep the communications up. He looked at Marco. You're coming with me. Obviously, Marco said. Don't. They drove at 110 miles per hour on the dark highway south, and Cassian sat in the passenger seat with his phone working through every channel he had, calling the 2 men he'd left at the estate, getting no answer on either, which told him the estate's communications had been cut or jammed, which told him the men Vale had sent were not amateurs, which he'd already known, but the confirmation of it sat in his chest like a coal. He called Shara Okafor and got her voicemail and left a message that said, 9 hours. If you don't hear from me, open the package I sent you 3 days ago and act on everything in it immediately. He had sent her a sealed physical package 3 days ago against exactly this kind of contingency. It contained the financial architecture, the property chain documentation, the warehouse coordinates, and a signed affidavit from Tomas. Not everything, but enough to start the collapse without Cassian's direct hand on it. He had not, 3 days ago, imagined he would be using that contingency this fast. Marco sat in the back seat beside Brandt and was quiet for the first 20 minutes. Then he said, "The thumb drive changes everything." "I know. If Seraphine can get it to Okafor in the right framing, I know Marco. The documented record inside the Vale files that makes me look cooperative. The drive has the counter documentation. Every contact with Renata Solis with timestamps and independent verification. If both are presented simultaneously, the framing collapses." He paused. "But the Vale lawyers will suppress the drive the minute they know it exists. The window for getting it into federal hands before Lucian's legal team can file for an injunction is hours," Cassian said. "I know. So what's the plan?" Cassian looked at the dark highway ahead of them, the white lines coming fast and vanishing under the car in a hypnotic pulse. His hands were loose in his lap. His breathing was deliberate and even. The plan had been destroyed and rebuilt twice in the last 6 hours, and was currently in a third iteration that he was still constructing in real time. "We get to Seraphine," he said. "We get her out of the panic room, we get her to the gala, and we end it there." Marco was quiet for a moment. "The gala is in 6 days. 5 now. And Lucien just sent men to our home, which means he's not waiting for the gala either." Cassian looked at his hands. "He moved his timeline when Tomas's man was made. We move ours now. We walk into the gala not as targets. We walk in as the people who've already won and just need the room to prove it. And if we're not the people who've already won," Cassian was quiet for a moment, "then we walk in anyway." "Boo it." They came off the highway at 1:47, and Tomas killed the headlights 3 blocks from the estate, and they moved the rest of the way running dark, which was more conspicuous in a different way, but less likely to give the Vale operatives at the gate a clean advance read on their approach. Cassian counted the vehicles from half a block out. 3, as Seraphine had said, black SUVs parked in a configuration that blocked the gate but also covered the sightlines from the front of the property. Professional setup. Someone who knew what they were doing had positioned those vehicles. He counted heads. 6 visible, which meant more inside. "East wall," Tomas said quietly, beside him. The estate's east wall bordered a narrow service alley that the property's original architects had designed for delivery access and which appeared on no publicly available floor plan. Cassian had surveyed it personally when he took the property. Tomas knew it from the same survey. They went over the wall in under a minute, Cassian, Marco, Tomas, and 2 of Brandt's men, and came down on the garden side into the dark and the cold and the dead grass and the bare-limbed trees, and they moved in a low, fast line toward the east face of the house, and Cassian kept his eyes on every window and counted lights and movement and tried to read the operational structure from the outside, the way you read a building you need to enter and survive. 2 men visible through the east-facing ground floor windows. Moving, not stationary. A search pattern, not a containment, which meant they hadn't found the panic room yet, or hadn't found what they were looking for, or were still working through the house systematically. The panic room was off the master suite on the 3rd floor. The staircase from the east entry had a blind approach from the interior that covered the first 2 flights. Cassian was through the east door. His key, his lock, his house, and on the first staircase landing before the nearest Vale operative turned from the window he'd been checking. The man got 1 syllable into a warning shout, and Taunce put him down cleanly and quietly, and Cassian was already on the 2nd flight. The second man was in the hallway outside the master suite, which put him 20 feet from the panic room door, and the man was good. He heard something in the stairwell that wasn't right, and was turning with his weapon up before Cassian cleared the landing. And there was a moment of approximately 1.5 seconds in which everything was in balance and nothing was resolved. and the hallway lights were on full, and both of them were entirely visible to each other, and the distance between them was 20 feet of Persian carpet, and Cassian's weapon was coming up, and the Veil operative's weapon was already up, and the half-second difference between those two facts was the entire margin. Marco came off the staircase behind Cassian and hit the operative from the left side, and the gun discharged into the ceiling, a flat crack that was going to bring everyone in the building to this floor in approximately 30 seconds. And they went down together into the hallway wall, and it was brief and violent and ugly, and when it was over, Marco was bleeding from a cut above his already scarred eyebrow, and the operative was zip-tied, and Cassian was at the panic room door. He knocked 3 times. Paused. 2 more. The pattern she'd remember because he'd told it to her 6 weeks ago in a conversation about security protocols that had felt theoretical at the time. 3 seconds. The lock cycled and the door opened, and Seraphine stood in the doorway of the panic room with a firearm. His backup piece, which he had not known she knew the location of and which she was holding with the kind of practiced grip that indicated she was not encountering a handgun for the first time. And her hair loose and her face pale and her eyes doing that reading the room thing at high speed. She looked at Marco, at the blood on his eyebrow, at Tomas in the hallway and the man on the floor, at the ceiling where the plaster was cracked from the discharged round. "How many did you leave at the gate?" she said. 6 visible, Cassian said. "There were 2 more inside before you got here." She lowered the weapon. "I heard them coming up the first staircase about 4 minutes ago, and I locked in." She looked at Cassian steadily. "I heard the shot. We're clear on this floor. We need to move." "I know." She stepped out of the panic room and looked at Marco again. Really looked at him, with the specific attention of someone taking an accurate inventory of what 3 years had cost. And she said, "You're Marco." "You're Seraphine," Marco said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite what his voice usually had, a kind of assessment that was warmer than he generally permitted himself in operational contexts. "He said you were with us." "I am," she said simply. Then to Cassian, "We can't hold this house. They'll regroup at the gate and come back with more." She had the notebook under her arm, he noticed. She'd brought it into the panic room. Of course she had. "We need a place they don't know." "Westchester," Cassian said. "Then let's go." They lost one of Brandt's men on the way back over the east wall, not to injury but to a Veil operative who'd moved to cover the alley, and the 2 minutes it took to resolve that situation were 2 minutes that cost them the clean departure window, and they were pulling away from the service alley and the vehicles as the 3 gate-parked SUVs began repositioning, and Tomas drove with the focused aggression of someone who has done pursuit and evasion work long enough that it has become reflexive. Seraphine sat in the back seat between Cassian and Marco and held the notebook on her lap and didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive, and Cassian could feel the contained energy coming off her. Not panic, nothing like panic, but the specific high-frequency tension of a person running at full cognitive load, processing at speed. Her hands were flat on the notebook cover. Her breathing was measured. The firearm was in the door pocket beside her because she'd put it there herself when she got in, which Cassian noted and didn't comment on. At the 11-minute mark, she said, "He knows the Westchester property." Cassian looked at her. "How?" "Because I know it." She met his eyes. "I found it in the property documentation 6 weeks ago when I was mapping your holdings. If I found it, his people found it. They're better resourced than I am." She looked back at the dark highway. "We can't go there." Cassian looked at Tomas. Tomas's eyes were on the road and his expression said, "She's right." "Then where?" Cassian said. "I have a place," Marco said. Both of them looked at him. "I had a location that was mine alone. No one in the Varelli network knew it. No one in the Veil network, because I was using it for the Renata Solis meetings. It's clean. I'm certain it's clean because the only person who knew about it was Renata. And if she'd given it to Lucien, I'd have been taken there, not at my apartment." He looked at the dark outside the window. "It's in the Bronx. It's not comfortable." "I don't need comfortable," Seraphine said. "It's a warehouse unit," Marco said. "Former textile storage." "I've slept in worse," she said, with a flatness that made both men briefly silent. Cut. The textile warehouse was on a dead-end street off the Sheridan Expressway. 4 stories of early industrial brick with a loading bay on the ground floor that Marco's key still opened. Inside, the second floor had been set up for long-term occupation in the spare, efficient style of someone who planned to spend serious time in a space and didn't intend to be comfortable about it. A folding table, 2 cots, a generator, a hardwired communications setup that Marco had installed himself, and filing cases full of documents that Cassian recognized immediately as the parallel investigation records. 3 years of Marco's work. The paper version of everything on the thumb drive and then some. Seraphine walked through the space slowly, taking it in, and then she set the notebook on the folding table and looked at the filing cases with the expression of someone who has just found an armory they didn't know was there. "This is everything," she said. "Everything I had before they took me," Marco said, "and everything I could hold in my head from what I built afterward. The thumb drive has the digital version, but..." He moved to the nearest filing case and opened it. "This is the original documentation, physical records. Harder to challenge in court than digital files because there's no chain of custody issue around electronic transfer." Seraphine looked at Cassian. "If we combine this with what I have..." "It's enough," Cassian said. "Is it enough for Okafor to move before the gala? If we get it to her in the right sequence? The financial architecture first, she already has that. Then the property chain, the trafficking routes, the warehouse documentation." He thought about the sequencing, and the counter documentation for Marco's framing. That has to go last, and it has to go with an affidavit from someone with standing. Marco looked at him. "Renata Solis. If she's findable, if she's willing..." "She left the Veil organization intact," Marco said. "She left with documentation. She had a reason for doing both of those things, and I don't think it was fear. She could have been afraid and stayed hidden. That's the safer play. She left visibly enough to show Lucien she was gone." He looked at the filing case. "She wanted to be found. By the right person." "Then we find her," Seraphine said. "How much time do we have?" Cassian looked at his watch. 2:41 in the morning. The gala was in just under 5 days. Okafor needed at least 48 hours to begin moving a federal warrant through the appropriate channels without Lucien's legal team being able to anticipate and counter it, which meant the documents needed to be in Okafor's hands in the next 12 hours. "Until morning," he said. That's it. They worked through what remained of the night. It was not elegant work. It was the work of 3 people around a folding table under fluorescent light, cross-referencing documents and notebooks, and 3 years of filed records, building the sequential case package that Shara Okafor needed to move on. Cassian organized the sequencing. Marco provided the verification layer, corroborating every document from the filing cases against his own operational memory, flagging the pieces that had independent confirmation and setting aside the pieces that didn't. Seraphine worked the notebook against the filing cases, matching her property chain records to Marco's operational documentation, and the degree to which they overlapped, the degree to which her 3 years of kitchen table intelligence work inside the Veil estate matched and extended and filled gaps in Marco's 3 years of fieldwork, was something none of them commented on directly, because commenting on it would have required a different kind of conversation than the one they were in the middle of. At 4 in the morning, Tomas produced coffee from somewhere and set it on the table without being asked, and went back to his position near the loading bay door. At 5:15, Seraphine straightened from the table and pressed both fists against the small of her back and looked at the assembled package: document binder, thumb drive, Marco's affidavit, her own signed statement, and said, "There's still the Renata problem." "I'm working on it," Marco said. He was on his phone, moving through a contact chain that he'd been navigating for the past hour. "If she won't surface, the package holds without her," Cassian said. "It's stronger with her because she can directly corroborate the framing attempt and provide inside testimony on the financial architecture's construction. But the package holds." "My father's lawyers will attack the framing documentation first," Seraphine said. "It's the piece that protects Marco. If they can establish that Marco had cooperative access to the Veil organization, everything else becomes circumstantial to a motive argument." She looked at Cassian. "They'll say you orchestrated this entire thing, that you used Marco to plant false evidence, married into the family to gain access, and when the plan started to collapse, you ran to the federal investigators to cut a deal." "I know. And without Renata's testimony, there's no one who can directly refute that narrative except Marco, who has obvious interest in his own exoneration, and me, who has obvious bias as your wife." She was very direct and very even, standing with her fists against her back and the fluorescent light making her face look exactly what it was, exhausted, resolved, entirely clear-eyed about the situation. "They'll destroy us on the stand." Cassian looked at her for a moment. "Do you trust me?" She looked back at him. "That's a complicated question." "I know. Answer it anyway." A moment. Her hands came down from her back and she crossed her arms in a way that was less defensive than structural, like someone organizing themselves. "Yes," she said. "Against my better judgment and full awareness of the circumstances under which this started, yes. Then trust me on Renata." He looked at Marco, who was still on the phone with his back partially turned. "Marco?" Marco held up one finger, then into the phone. "Tell her it's the Bronx address. She'll know what that means." He listened for a moment, then, "Tell her we have the filing cases. All of them." He listened again, his jaw tightened. "Tell her Marco said the documentation is complete and the window is closing, and if she was waiting for the right moment, this is it." He hung up. He turned to look at them. 2 hours, he said. En tête. Renata Solis arrived at the warehouse at 7:40 in the morning in a car she drove herself, a gray sedan with no distinguishing features, and she parked it at the end of the dead-end street and walked to the loading bay with the unhurried gait of someone who had been moving carefully through hostile territory for so long that caution had become indistinguishable from her natural walk. She was 43, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that held information without broadcasting it, watchful and still and precise, the face of someone who had spent 11 years building the financial skeleton of a criminal organization and had spent the following 14 months deciding what to do about that. She looked at Marco first, with the specific quality of someone seeing a thing they'd wondered for a long time whether they'd see again. "You look terrible," she said. "You look like someone who's been hiding for 14 months, Marco said. "I've been working," she said, "not hiding." She shifted her gaze to Cassian, assessed him in a single sweep, then Seraphine, who she looked at for slightly longer, with something that wasn't quite recognition, but sat in the neighborhood of it. "You have the filing cases." "And a thumb drive," Cassian said. "And my notebook," Seraphine said. Renata looked at the notebook, then back at Seraphine. "Lucien's daughter," she said. "I always wondered if you were doing what it looked like you were doing." "What did it look like?" Seraphine said. "Like someone paying very close attention and waiting for an opportunity." A pause. "I was right." "You were," Seraphine said. Renata came to the table and sat, and Cassian put coffee in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the assembled package and said, "Tell me what you need from me and when you need it." The next 18 hours were the most operationally compressed of Cassian's life, and that was a significant statement given the life he had lived. Renata's testimony, given to Shara Okafor in a secured federal office in Lower Manhattan at 2 in the afternoon with Cassian present and Marco present via a secure video connection from a location that was not the textile warehouse, ran to 4 hours. She had documents of her own, held in an attorney's escrow, in a format designed to be released automatically if she missed a weekly check-in, and those documents constituted the original financial architecture of the Vale offshore network, drawn in Renata's own hand, annotated, dated, and cross-referenced in a way that no one who had not built the system from the ground up could have fabricated. Okafor listened. She asked questions with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this specific information for 3 years and knew exactly where the gaps were. She filled the gaps as they came in with a focused efficiency that reminded Cassian of Seraphine at the dining room table. The same quality of intelligence that had been pointed at a specific problem for long enough that it had developed the exact right shape to fit the problem's contours. At 6:17 in the evening, Okafor looked up from the last document in the package and looked at Cassian and said, "I can move on the warrant tomorrow morning. The gala is in 4 days. I want eyes on the venue by morning, and I want a federal presence inside the event, undercover, with authorization to act if—" "There's a bomb," Seraphine said. Okafor looked at her. "Okafor, my father has been using the Foundation's gala as the detonation point. I don't have the specific technical details. I found references in the operational files to a structural preparation at the venue and the timing of the event's coordination with the offshore account transfers." She opened the notebook to a specific page. The account transfers complete the day of the gala. After that, the money is gone. And the gala is the last event in the venue before it closes for renovation. She looked at Okafor. He's planned for the building not to be standing after the event. The federal office was very quiet. Okafor looked at the page for a long moment. Then she looked up. I need the venue swept tonight. You need authorization for that, Cassian said. I'll have it in 2 hours. She was already reaching for her phone. Where will you be? Getting ready, Cassian said. Bobbed. The next 4 days moved with the specific quality of time that is simultaneously too fast and too slow. The operational preparation eating the hours at a speed that felt insufficient, and the waiting between operational beats stretching with an almost physical weight. Cassian moved through the preparation with the focus of someone who has resolved the internal argument and emerged on the other side of it into a kind of stripped-down clarity. He was not doing this for the plan anymore. The plan was dead. He was doing this because his brother was alive and scarred and deserved to walk in daylight again. Because a woman had spent 26 years in a cage and had used every hour of it to prepare for the one moment the cage opened. Because a city full of people who didn't know any of this were going to be in a building on a Friday night in December with a bomb beneath the floor. And because Lucian Vale had built his frame carefully over 3 years, and had done it well, and deserved to see every piece of it handed back to him in the wrong order. Seraphine came to find him the evening before the gala. He was in the textile warehouse. They had stayed there, all of them, the past 4 days, which had the strange domestic quality of a situation too urgent for comfort. Standing at the window that looked out over the Sheridan Expressway, watching the headlights in the dark below. She came and stood beside him without speaking. She was wearing the black long-sleeve shirt, and her hair was back, and she had the notebook under her arm, which he'd come to think of as simply part of how she stood. After a moment, she said, Federal Sweep found the device at the venue this afternoon. I know, Okafor called. It was more sophisticated than anticipated. The disposal team said it was professionally constructed, enough to bring down the main structural elements of the upper 4 floors. She looked out the window. 200 people on the guest list. He said nothing. He was going to kill 200 people to close a financial transaction and frame a dead man. She said it without inflection, the way you say a thing that is so far outside the normal scale of human behavior that emotional register becomes inadequate. His own daughter in the building. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I don't want to talk about how I feel about that. I know. I want to talk about tomorrow. Tell me. She turned from the window and looked at him directly, and the exhaustion in her face had changed over the course of the past 4 days into something different. Something that sat alongside the exhaustion rather than underneath it. Something less like survival and more like intention. Okafor has the device. She has the warrant. She has the evidence package. She has Renata's testimony. The federal case is built. She held his eyes. But my father doesn't know any of that yet. He still thinks he's walking into the gala tomorrow night with his frame intact. Yes, which means he's going to be there. Yes, and when the federal agents move, when the arrest happens, he's going to understand in that moment that everything he built has been handed to the wrong people. Her jaw set once. I want to be the one who tells him, before the agents take him. I want to be standing in front of him, and I want him to hear it from me. She paused. Not revenge. I want him to know that I was the one who took it apart, that I saw what he built and I took it apart. I want him to know that before anything else happens. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. You'll have to be inside the building before we do, he said, before the federal presence moves. Your father expects you there. He needs you there for the frame, which means you can walk in clean and I can't. He thought through the geometry of it. You go in first. You find him before the event starts. You have whatever conversation you need to have. I'll come in from the north access with Tomas and Brandt at 9, and Okafor's team moves at 9:15 regardless. And the 9 minutes between your entry and the team moving. 9 minutes for us to make sure Lucian is in the room and not running. He looked at her. Can you keep him in the room for 9 minutes? She almost smiled. That same specific, not quite smile he'd seen once before, the one that sat on the edge of irony. I've kept him thinking he controlled me for 26 years, she said. 9 minutes is nothing. He looked at her face, the marks that lived beneath her sleeves, the exhaustion that was changing into something else, the eyes that had been direct and reading and never pretending for as long as he'd known them, and the thing in his chest that had been doing something loud and insistent since the garden bench on that November afternoon did it again, louder this time, and the gala was tomorrow. Seraphine was putting on the black velvet gown at 7 in the morning and pressing her palms flat against the fabric and looking at herself in the mirror of the textile warehouse's inadequate bathroom. And Cassian was standing in the doorway watching her, and she turned and looked at him and said, "Don't say anything reassuring." "I wasn't going to." "Good." She looked back at the mirror, reached for the long silk gloves that covered her arms to the elbow, pulled them on with practiced efficiency, the way she'd been doing it for years, and then she stopped with one glove half on and looked at her bare forearm in the mirror, the silver topography of it in the fluorescent light. And she left it there for a moment, just looked at it. Then she finished pulling the glove on and turned back to Cassian. "Let's go end this," she said. The venue was a tower in Midtown Manhattan, 40 stories of glass and steel that the Vail Foundation had been renting for its annual gala for 7 consecutive years. And at 8:45 that Friday night in December, it blazed with light from the 40th floor down against a sky that was dropping the first snow of the season in fine, dry flakes that caught the light of every window and turned the whole building into something that looked, from the street, like the tower blazed against the December sky like something that had decided to burn on its own terms. Seraphine stood on the sidewalk across the street for exactly 30 seconds before going in. She'd asked the car to stop half a block south, and she'd walked the rest of the way in the snow, alone, the black velvet gown under a long coat that she'd open and check in the lobby, and she stood with the cold coming through the fabric and the fine dry snow settling in her hair, and she looked up at the 40th floor and let herself feel the full weight of it. One complete breath in, one complete breath out, the way she had learned to do in the years when breathing was the only thing in a given hour that belonged to her. Then she crossed the street and went in. The lobby was marble and chrome and controlled warmth, attendance at a check-in table with a guest list on a tablet, and Seraphine gave her name and watched the attendant's face register the specific quality of recognition that attached to the Vail name in rooms like this one. Not admiration exactly, more like a careful readjustment of posture, a slight brightening of professional attention that was really the visible surface of an awareness that this name required a certain handling. She knew the look. She had been producing it in people her entire life. She took the elevator to the 40th floor alone and rode it in silence and watched her own reflection in the polished elevator doors, the gown, the gloves, the hair she'd put up tonight because that was how her father expected her to wear it at events, pinned and contained and formal. And she thought about the morning, about standing in the textile warehouse bathroom with one glove half on and looking at her arm in the mirror. She thought about leaving the glove off. She had thought about it for a full 30 seconds and then put it on anyway, not because she was ashamed, but because tonight required a specific performance, and the performance had specific costuming, and she knew the difference between choosing to cover something and being forced to. The elevator opened into the foyer of the 40th floor event space, which was already populated with the specific crowd that her father assembled for these occasions. A carefully calibrated mix of legitimate and illegitimate power in which the illegitimate wore better suits and had more practiced smiles. She scanned the room in the way she always scanned rooms, cataloging exits, weight distributions, who was stationed where and why, and she found her father in approximately 11 seconds because she had been reading rooms that contained Lucian Vale since she was old enough to understand that knowing where he was at all times was a matter of self-preservation. He was near the windows, the north-facing, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Midtown Manhattan's luminous geometry, the city spread below in its indifferent, gorgeous entirety. He was in a black tuxedo, holding a glass of something amber, speaking to a man Seraphine recognized as a city councilman who had been on the Vail payroll for 6 years. He had his back partially to the room in the way of a man who is not afraid of anything in it. He saw her when she was still 40 feet away. His eyes moved to her with the practiced scan of a man who has maintained surveillance on the people around him for so long that the surveillance has become as automatic as breathing. He excused himself from the councilman without looking away from her and came across the room to meet her. "You look beautiful," he said. His voice was warm and his eyes were assessing, and both things were completely genuine, which was the thing about Lucian Vale that had always been the most difficult to metabolize.
that the warmth was real even when everything it served was not. "Thank you," she said.
He kissed her cheek. His aftershave was the same one he had worn her entire life, cedar and something colder underneath. And the smell of it produced in her the specific bodily response of a 26-year conditioned association that she had learned to observe without acting on, a kind of internal weather that passed through her and left without changing anything structural. "Your husband isn't here yet," he said. "He'll be here by 9. Lucien looked at her for a moment, just a moment, the duration of a single read, and then nodded and smiled and took her elbow in the light proprietary way he had always taken her elbow, the way that looked like affection from across the room and felt like inventory. "Come. I want to introduce you to someone before the remarks." She went with him. She had 9 minutes to keep him in the room, and she had not yet started counting. The north access to the building was a service entrance off 53rd Street that Okafor's team had cleared and held since 8 o'clock, and Cassian came through it at 8:58 with Tomas on his left and Brandt on his right and 3 additional men behind them, all in tuxedos that made them look like the event staff they were presenting as. And the service elevator took them to the 39th floor, from which a staircase provided internal access to the 40th. He had a communication piece in his right ear, open channel to Okafor's operations coordinator. He could hear the low murmur of the channel, confirmations, position reports, the compact professional language of federal agents who have done this before, and know that economy of words in an operational context is a form of discipline. At 8:59, Okafor's coordinator said, "All positions confirmed. Device disposal team reports venue clear, structural integrity confirmed. Warrant is active. We move at 9:15. "Copy," Cassian said, barely above a breath. In his earpiece he heard Okafor herself. "Varelli, is she in position?" "She's been in position," he said. "She's been in position her whole life." A beat. Then, 9:15. Don't be early. He took the staircase at 9:01 and came through the service door at the north edge of the 40th floor's outer corridor at 9:03, and he stood behind the partition that separated the service corridor from the event space and looked through the gap at the room. The room was full. 200 people in formal wear beneath crystal chandeliers, an orchestra in the far corner playing something that was appropriately celebratory and appropriately anonymous, waitstaff moving with practiced smoothness through the crowd with trays of champagne. A podium near the south windows, where the remarks would be given. The Vale Foundation banner above it, in navy and gold. He found Seraphine in 7 seconds. She was near the center of the room, standing beside Lucien Vale, speaking to 2 people Cassian didn't recognize. Her posture perfect, and her expression calibrated at the precise setting she had been calibrating it to her entire life. From this distance, she looked like exactly what her father needed her to look like tonight. He watched her for a moment. Her hands were still. Her weight was evenly distributed. She hadn't looked toward the service corridor, and she wasn't going to because she knew the location of every door in this room, and she knew he was through one of them and looking for the specific sightline that would tell him what he needed to know about her status. And she was giving him that sightline by standing exactly where she was standing. She was fine. She was more than fine. 9 minutes. She was holding it. At 9:09, Lucien Vale said, "Excuse me," to the couple he and Seraphine were speaking with, and took Seraphine's elbow again, and moved her toward the edge of the crowd, away from the center, toward the east-facing windows that were slightly less occupied than the north face. Seraphine went with him and kept her breathing even. "The remarks will start at 9:30, he said, when they were sufficiently removed from the nearest cluster of guests. "I want you at the podium at 9:25. Brief introduction, family legacy framing, welcome the guests to the Foundation's most important year yet." He looked at her with the warmth that was real. "You've prepared something." "I've prepared something," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, reading the way he always read her, checking the surface for information beneath it. She had spent 26 years learning to give him a surface that held under that specific kind of reading, and she gave it to him now. Steady, compliant, the surface of a woman who had accepted her role and was here to perform it. "Good," he said. He looked out the east window at the city. "After tonight, things will be different. The Foundation enters a new chapter. Some of the complexity of the past few years gets resolved." He said this the way he said everything,
smoothly, with the cadence of a man who has always been the most powerful person in every room he's entered. I want you to know that you've been essential to making that possible. Seraphine looked at his profile against the city lights.
I know, she said. He looked at her, smiled. She smiled back. 6 minutes. The thing about Lucy Yan Vale that Seraphine had understood for a long time but had never had the standing ground to act on was this. He was not a man who made mistakes in the ordinary sense. He did not forget things, overlook things, or misjudge people out of carelessness. When he was wrong, and he was rarely wrong, it was because he had modeled a situation accurately and then failed to account for the possibility that the situation itself would change in a way outside his model. He was a superb reader of static conditions. He was not built for the dynamic. He had modeled Seraphine as a static condition for 26 years. He had never updated the model. She watched him scan the room at 9/11, and she watched his eyes pass over the service corridor partition on the north wall without stopping, and she understood that his failure to stop on it was not because he had missed the slight difference in the positioning of the partition. He had not missed it. She could tell from the micro-adjustment of his focus. But because his model told him that whatever was behind it was not a threat he needed to weigh against the operational calculus of this particular evening. He had not updated the model. She looked at the east window and the city beyond it, and thought, not much longer. At 9:13, Lucian's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He removed it, glanced at the screen, and something changed in his face. It was minimal. A tightening around the eyes, a very slight shift in the set of his jaw, the specific micro-expression of a man receiving information that requires immediate recalibration. He looked at the screen for 2 seconds. Then he looked up and across the room at the service corridor partition with the kind of focus he had not given it before. He looked at Seraphine. She held his eyes. And she understood in that moment that someone had told him. Not Okafor. Okafor was operational and sealed. Not Tomas, not Brandt. But somewhere in the 9-layer organization that Lucienne Vale had built over 3 decades, something had moved in a direction it wasn't supposed to move. And someone had flagged it, and the flag had reached him 30 seconds before the window closed. "What did you do?" he said. His voice was very quiet and very even, which was how his voice was when he was most dangerous. Not raised. Never raised. The danger in Lucienne Vale had always lived in the low register. Seraphine looked at him and felt her pulse in her throat and kept her face entirely still. "I'm here for the gala, Father." "What did you do?" he said again. 2 minutes. She thought, I have to keep him in this room. She said, I did what you taught me to do. I watched and I waited. And I understood the situation better than anyone thought I did. She held his eyes. That's what you told me. When I was 12. Before you broke my collarbone. You told me the most important skill was patience. You told me the truly powerful don't move until they can't lose. She kept her voice as even as his. I was paying attention. His face did something then. Not the warmth, which was gone now, and not the calculation, which was still running. Something older than both of those. Something that lived in the part of him that had been a father before it had been a crime lord, and that had been a crime lord for so much longer that the other part was nearly inaccessible. A recognition, not of what she'd done, of who she was. He had not seen her before, not fully. He had seen a liability he could manage. He had never looked at her and seen what was actually there. He saw it now. It won't hold, he said. Whatever you gave them. The legal architecture alone. Renata Solis gave a 4-hour deposition yesterday afternoon, Seraphine said. She built the architecture. She knows every joint. And she documented it for 14 months before she left your organization, which you knew and decided was manageable. She watched his face. It wasn't manageable. 1 minute. Lucian Vale stood very still. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, the full, unguarded look of a man who has just had the ground reorganize itself beneath him and is in the process of understanding the new geography. And in the looking was something she had never expected to see on his face. Not remorse. She had long since made peace with the certainty that she would never see remorse from this man, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized the specific shape of what had just happened the way you recognize the shape of something irreversible. Your mother would have, he started. Don't,
Seraphine said. Don't use her name tonight. He stopped. The room went on around them. 200 people in formal wear, an orchestra, champagne, and in the small pocket of stillness where they stood by the east windows, everything that had been between them for 26 years sat in the open air for the first and last time. You were born weak, he said. The same words. The ones from the warehouse, the ones she had been waiting to face since she was 8 years old in a hallway, learning what loss meant. No, she said, I was born yours, and I survived it anyway. The doors opened. Amdechuan. Shara Okafor came through the main entrance at 9:15, exactly with 14 federal agents in formal wear who ceased to be in formal wear approximately 4 seconds after clearing the entrance, and the effect on the room was immediate and total. The specific quality of stillness that descends on a space when authority enters it, with enough mass and clarity of purpose that the people in the space understand in the same moment that the event they came for is not the event that's happening. Cassian came through the service corridor partition at 9:15 and 2 seconds, and he moved directly through the crowd towards Seraphine and Lucien with Tomas on his left, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for people moving with that particular directed energy. And he reached Seraphine and stood beside her and looked at Lucien Vale. Lucien looked back at him. Cassian Varelli, Lucien said. His voice was entirely controlled. The warmth was gone, but the control remained. The lifelong professional composure of a man who had always understood that how you lost was the last thing people remembered. I underestimated you. You underestimated her, Cassian said. He didn't look away from Lucien. I was secondary. Okafor reached them at 9:15 and 40 seconds, and she looked at Lucien Vale with the face of someone who has been building toward a single moment for 3 years and has arrived at it and found it exactly the size she'd expected. Lucien Vale, she said. Federal arrest warrant, RICO statute, trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and 8 subsidiary charges. You have the right to remain silent. Lucien looked at his daughter one more time. Seraphine looked back at him and did not look away, and he saw on her face something he had never once put there and had never known was missing. The simple fact of a person who has completed a long and necessary thing and is standing in the completion of it. He looked away first. The agents moved. Pause. The room came apart in the structured way that rooms come apart when federal agents are moving through them with warrants and purpose. Controlled chaos. The guests separating into those who had reasons to leave quickly and those who were simply frightened. 4 additional arrests as Okafor's team identified secondary targets from the network, the orchestra stopping mid-phrase, and the resulting silence landing over everything like snow. Cassian stood beside Seraphine and neither of them moved for a moment. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which had been doing something aggressive for the past 9 minutes and was beginning now, incrementally, to negotiate down to something more sustainable. He was aware of Seraphine's arm against his, the silk of the glove against his jacket sleeve, the specific stillness of her that was different from the controlled stillness of the previous 9 minutes, looser somehow, like a tension released so gradually you don't notice it's gone until you notice the absence of it. Marco appeared from the east entrance. He had come in separately, through Okafor's official team, which meant he had entered the building tonight through a legitimate federal access point for the first time in 3 years. And he came through the thinning crowd and found Cassian and stopped and looked at him and looked at the room and looked at where Lucien Vale was being walked toward the main entrance by 2 agents. It held, Marco said. It held, Cassian said. Marco looked at Seraphine. You were 12 minutes, he said. I was told 9. I needed 12, she said. I know. You were right. He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything. Thank you. She looked back at him. You spent 3 years in a warehouse building the case that made this possible, she said. Don't thank me. I'm thanking you anyway. She accepted this with a small nod, the specific nod of someone who is not practiced at receiving gratitude and is doing it imperfectly and doesn't care. The building emptied over the next 2 hours. Federal agents worked the floor. Tomas coordinated with Okafor's team on secondary arrests across the city, 7 simultaneous actions targeting Vale network nodes, timed to hit in the same 90-minute window as the gala, the culmination of Okafor's 3-year case hitting on every front at once.
The councilman Seraphine had recognized was arrested outside the elevator. A deputy commissioner received a call at his dinner table in Brooklyn. 3 judges would find federal agents at their doors before midnight. The Vail Foundation banner came down from above the podium at some point while Cassian was on the phone with Okafor's coordinator, and a federal agent folded it with the impersonal efficiency of someone processing evidence, and it was placed in a labeled bag, and that was the end of that particular piece of theater. Cassian found Seraphine at 11 o'clock sitting on a chair near the north windows with her heels off and her feet on the cold marble floor and the long silk gloves removed and sitting in her lap, her arms bare in the ambient light of the emptying room. She was looking out the windows at the city, which was still doing what it did, indifferent, enormous, carrying on, with the snow still coming down in fine dry increments that made the streetlights below into something almost beautiful. He sat in the chair beside her. She didn't look at him. She kept looking at the city. "They found documentation in my father's personal files," she said. "Okafor told me 20 minutes ago. A file on my mother, the real record." She paused. "It was what I thought it was." He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be adequate, and he was not going to offer something inadequate. "I've known since I was 8, she said. "But knowing and having the documentation are different things. The documentation means it's real in a way that can be stated plainly to other people and have them understand it." She looked at the city. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse." "Both," he said. "Probably both." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Both." They sat in the cooling, emptied room for a while, and the snow continued its work on the city below. Cassian looked at her profile, the marks on her arms catching the ambient light, the specific way she held her face when she wasn't performing anything for anyone, which was different from any face he'd seen her wear in the months he'd known her. Younger somehow. Or not younger, just without the years of management that the public face required. "What happens now?" she said. "Okafor has everything she needs. The trial will take 2 years minimum. The offshore accounts get frozen in the next 72 hours. The federal financial action is already drafted and moving." "I know the legal structure," she said. "I meant for us." He looked at the city. He thought about the plan, the 6-year plan, the tool and the key and the lock and the controlled demolition. He thought about the 47 pages that hadn't told him anything that mattered. He thought about the garden bench and the November air and the gate that had always been there. "I don't have a plan for this part," he said. She looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. Her eyes were tired and clear and direct, as they always were, and they did the reading thing, as they always did, the quick, accurate scan for information beneath the surface. "I know," she said. "That's the first honest answer you've given me that wasn't forced out of you by circumstances." He almost smiled. "I was more honest than you're giving me credit for." "You were honest when you had no better option," she said. "It's different." But there was something in her voice that was different from the factual accounting tone. Warmer, slightly. The way the city below was warmer than the air above it because the city was generating its own heat. "I married you as a key and a lock," he said. "I want you to know that I know that, and that I know what it cost you to work with what I was." She was quiet for a moment. "You want me to tell you it's all right?" "No, I want you to know that I know." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the city. "You could have let me be the casualty," she said. "When you understood the full frame, when you understood your brother was alive and my father had built the collapse around both of us. The cleanest play was to extract Marco, hand the evidence to Okafor, and let the frame fall where it fell. You would have survived it. Varelli name takes some damage. The federal case is messier without the insider testimony, but you were never the primary target." She paused. "You came back for me." "You were in the panic room because of me." "I was in the panic room because of my father," she said. "Be accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "I came back for you," he said. "Not because of the plan." She absorbed this. The city went on below them. Marco was somewhere in the room behind them talking to one of Okafor's agents, his voice a low familiar murmur that Cassian had not heard for 3 years and was still in the process of believing was real. Tomas was near the entrance. The federal agents were finishing their work. "I don't know how to do this," Seraphine said quietly. "Whatever this is, I don't have a reference point for it. I know how to survive things. I know how to endure things and map things and wait for the right moment and use what I have. She looked at her hands in her lap, the gloves folded there, the marks on her arms in the low light. I don't know how to just have something. I don't know what that feels like. I don't either, he said. I've been running the plan for 6 years. I don't know what I am without it. She looked at him. That's terrifying. Yes. And you're not running from it. No. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and picked up one of the silk gloves from her lap and looked at it, and then she set it deliberately on the windowsill beside her and left it there. Just the one. Her right arm bare, the marks visible in the light, and her left still gloved, and the asymmetry of it was completely intentional and completely hers, and she didn't explain it. She didn't need to. 3 weeks later, the headlines finished their initial cycle and moved on to the next thing, the way headlines do. The Vale Empire's financial collapse took 11 days from the gala to complete dissolution. The offshore accounts frozen. The shell company chain unwound by federal financial forensics. The Vale Foundation's board dissolved, and its assets placed in receivership pending investigation of the trafficking route's proceeds. The foundation's name disappeared from buildings and letterheads and charity galas with the specific speed of things that had always been contingent on power that no longer existed. The simultaneous arrests held. No one walked. The deputy commissioner turned state's evidence inside 48 hours, which accelerated the secondary prosecution of 3 city officials and 2 members of the state judiciary who had been in the Vale network for a combined 31 years. Renata Solis entered federal witness protection after her deposition was entered into the record, and the question of her original allegiance, whether she had been genuine from the start or had turned genuinely at some point along the way, remained the kind of question that didn't have a clean answer and probably never would. Marco chose to believe the latter, and that choice was his, and Cassian respected it. The Virelli Syndicate's criminal operations were wound down under a federal consent agreement that Cassian negotiated with Okafor over 2 weeks of careful legal architecture. The agreement was possible because Cassian had never been the primary target of the federal case, and because the intelligence he and Seraphine had provided constituted substantial cooperation credit, and because Shara Okafor was a pragmatic person who understood the difference between the enemy and the instrument. The Virelli name moved into legitimate security and shipping operations under federal oversight, which was not the end Cassian had imagined when he was 22 and running the plan in his head for the first time. But it was an end that let his men work and let his family name mean something other than what Lucian Vale had tried to make it mean. Marco spent 2 weeks in a private medical facility and then moved into an apartment in Astoria 4 blocks from where their mother lived, and Elena Virelli, who had spent 3 years carrying the weight of not knowing, sat with her older son in her kitchen every morning for the first month and fed him the same things she had fed him when he was 12 years old and said very little, because some things do not require language. Cassian visited on a Sunday in late January. He sat at his mother's kitchen table and drank her coffee and watched Marco eat and felt the thing in his chest that had been locked for 3 years do the last of its unlocking, which was quiet and undramatic and felt like nothing more than a long breath. His mother looked at him over her coffee and said, "The girl. Her name is Seraphine," Cassian said. "Is she good to you?" He thought about this. He thought about the garden bench and the textile warehouse and the 40th floor and the silk glove on the windowsill. "She's honest with me," he said. "Which is better?" His mother looked at him the way mothers look at their children when the children have finally said the thing they were supposed to figure out. "Good," she said. "Bring her Sunday." Seraphine cut her hair in February, not drastically, 2 inches, enough to change the line of it, enough to change the specific way it fell. She had worn it a certain way for 26 years because the way she wore it had been one of the things that had been decided for her. And one morning in the apartment she and Cassian were sharing on the west side of Manhattan, not the estate on East 64th, which she had no intention of ever returning to, she sat in front of the bathroom mirror and cut it herself with the scissors from the kitchen drawer, which was not the sophisticated approach, but was the correct one. Cassian found the hair in the bathroom and didn't mention it. She bought clothes that month. Not many. She was not by nature a person who accumulated things, and the preceding 26 years had given her a bone-deep relationship with owning less rather than more, which was one of the things that had been done to her that had accidentally produced a useful characteristic. But she bought what she wanted, which was the significant part, in colors that were hers and cuts that were hers, and she wore them without the performance layer that had always been the second garment on top of whatever she was actually wearing. The therapy was harder than she'd expected, which was what she told Cassian when he asked, 3 months in, and he didn't offer a response because she hadn't asked for one, and the not asking for one and the not offering were both evidence of something they had worked out between them slowly and imperfectly over the course of the winter. Her arms were not covered most of the time now. Not all the time. There were days when covering them was what she wanted, and she covered them, because her choice and her arms were the same thing. And choosing when to cover and when not to was the exercise of a freedom she was still learning the full dimensions of. The marks were there. They would always be there. They had been made at a cost she hadn't consented to and had survived at a cost she had, and both of those things were true simultaneously. And the simultaneous truth of them was something she had stopped trying to resolve into a single clean narrative. The scars remained. They did not own her. On a Thursday evening in early March, Cassian came home to find Seraphine at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. Not the operational notebook that had been entered into federal evidence and was now part of a case file that would be cited in the trial. A new one. Same size, similar worn spine, as if her hand had naturally sought the same dimensions. She was writing in it, and when he set his jacket on the chair, she looked up at him with the direct eyes and the reading the room look that he had stopped finding unsettling somewhere in the preceding months and had started finding simply her. "What are you writing?" he said. She looked at the notebook. "Things I want," she said. "I've been writing down what I survived for years. I thought I'd try writing what I want instead." She looked at him. "It's shorter. I'm working on making it longer." He sat across from her. "What's on the list?" She considered. "A dog," she said. "I've always wanted a dog and I never had one because they require stability, and I never had stability." She looked back at the notebook. "To sleep past 6 in the morning without waking up afraid. That one's going to take longer." A pause. "To testify at the trial. Okafor asked me last week if I would be willing. I said yes." "That will be hard," he said. "I know. I want to do it anyway." She looked at him with the look that had no performance in it. "I want it on record, my name on it. Not as a Vale, not as a Virelli, just as myself." She closed the notebook. "I want that." He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Thursday evening, with the city doing its March thing outside the window, cold still but beginning, just barely, to consider the possibility of something else. He thought about the night he'd stood in the bedroom of the estate watching her remove borrowed earrings in silence, and the 47 pages that hadn't known anything about who she was, and the plan that he'd spent 6 years building and that had been built inside a frame he hadn't known existed, and all the things that had been instruments and had turned out to be something else entirely. He thought about his brother eating in their mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. He thought about Renata Solis and her 14 months of waiting and whatever it was she'd been waiting for. He thought about Shara Okafor, who would spend the next 2 years in courtrooms dismantling what had taken 30 years to build, and who would do it correctly and thoroughly, and who had said to Cassian at the end of their last meeting, "The next time you decide to run an operation inside a federal jurisdiction, call me first." And he had said, "There won't be a next time." And she had looked at him with the look of a woman who believed him. He thought about what it meant to stop running something. He thought about the notebook, the new one, with the things she wanted instead of the things she'd survived. "I want to be on that list," he said. Not sure, until it was out, that he was going to say it. Not sorry, once it was. Seraphine looked at him across the table, the reading the room look, the 30-second processing interval. Then she opened the notebook to the page she'd been writing, and without taking her eyes off him, she wrote something. She turned it to face him. His name, just his name. Already there, written before he'd asked. He looked at it for a moment. "I've been working on the list for a while," she said. He looked up at her, and she was almost smiling. The real one. The one that was still new enough to be slightly startling, that sat on her face like something learning the space. And outside the window, the city was doing what the city did. All 10 million people carrying their own accumulations of survival and wanting. Hunting, and below them, the lights went on as they always did, block by block, in the long, patient work of pushing back the dark. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the grip of the garden bench, not the operational contact of people coordinating under pressure, but the plain ordinary weight of two hands in the same place, belonging to two people who had come through the fire by very different routes and arrived, improbably, at the same kitchen table on a Thursday evening in early March. "No more cages," he said. She turned her hand and held his back. "No more cages," she said, "and no more plans we don't make together." The city lights moved against the dark horizon, and the snow was gone, and the window held both their reflections faintly in the glass. Not the performance versions, not the instruments, not the weapons or the keys or the tools, just themselves, which was the most dangerous and most necessary thing either of them had ever agreed to be. Outside, March was making its slow argument for something warmer. They let it.